Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quietest places on Earth sometimes carry the loudest questions. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide, flat valley in northeastern Utah, somewhere in the middle of a clear evening, with the kind of sky above you that you only really find in the American West. Enormous and low and faintly purple at the edges, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very awake at the same time. The land around you is red and dry. Sagebrush covers the valley floor in pale grey-green clusters. There are mesas in the distance, flat-topped and rust-coloured, catching the last of the light. The air is still. There is almost no sound. And somewhere out there, roughly 5 miles southwest of the small town of Ballard, Utah, sits a piece of land that has drawn scientists, military intelligence officials, journalists, ranchers, and researchers from around the world, not because of what they found there, but because of what they could not explain. This is the Winter Basin, and tonight we're going to spend some time with its most unusual address. The property sits in Winter County, in the northeastern corner of Utah, covering roughly 512 acres of that flat, quiet valley floor. For most of its recorded history, it was just a working ranch, the kind of place where families raised cattle, kept to themselves, and watched the seasons move slowly across the basin. It had a name before it had a reputation. People in the area called it the Sherman Ranch, after the family that owned it in the early 1990s. But at some point, and we will get to exactly when and how, it acquired a different name, the name it carries now: Skinwalker Ranch. That name did not come from a television producer or a marketing team. It came from something older. The word skinwalker in Navajo tradition refers to a Yi-Nallushi, a witch or sorcerer with the power to transform into an animal or to inhabit one, moving through the world in disguise, causing harm. The Ute people of the Winter Basin have their own related tradition, their own word for a figure of transformation and dread that belongs to this land. The name was attached to this particular stretch of valley not by outsiders looking for a dramatic title, but by the people whose ancestors lived here long before any ranch existed. That is worth noting early, because it shapes everything that comes after. The strangeness at this location, whatever it is, was not invented by the modern era. It was already here. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you tonight? Are you at home, settled in somewhere comfortable? Is the sky clear above you, or is it cloudy? If you stepped outside right now and looked up, what would you see? I ask, because this story is, in part, about the sky, about what people have seen in it, what they have tried to measure inside it, and what has refused to be explained by any of the instruments pointed at it. The sky over the Winter Basin is very wide and very dark at night, and for decades now, people have been watching it carefully from this particular piece of land and coming away with more questions than they arrived with. If you enjoy this kind of slow, careful storytelling, the kind that takes its time, that tries to be honest about what is known and what is not, that treats strange subjects with genuine curiosity rather than noise, then please consider subscribing to the channel, and if tonight's story is the kind of thing you want to hear more of, a like goes a long way. It helps other people find their way here. And now, quietly, let us begin. Let us. The Winter Basin itself is a large sedimentary basin. Geologically speaking, a bowl-shaped depression formed over millions of years, sitting at roughly 4,700 to 5,000 feet above sea level. The Green River runs through it. The Winter Mountains rise to the north. The basin floor is wide and relatively flat, and the soil is a mix of clay, sandstone, and ancient lakebed sediment from the Eocene epoch, a period roughly 34 to 56 million years ago when a large freshwater lake called Lake Winter covered much of this region. That geological history matters more than you might expect. The basin has unusual subsurface characteristics. There are natural gas deposits. There are areas of unusual magnetic variation. The ground beneath the valley floor is not simple or uniform, and some researchers believe that the physical properties of this particular piece of Earth may be relevant to the events that have been reported here. We will come back to that idea later. For now, just hold it lightly. The town of Ballard, the nearest community to the ranch, has a population of somewhere around 700 people. It is a small, quiet agricultural community. The people who live there are, for the most part, practical people. Farmers, ranchers, people who work with their hands and do not tend toward dramatic storytelling. And yet, when journalists and researchers have spent time in Ballard and the surrounding communities, what they have consistently found is that the strangeness associated with the ranch is not news to the locals. Many families in the area have their own accounts. Lights in the sky, animals behaving oddly, a general sense that the land in that particular part of the valley is not quite like the land anywhere else. These are not people with anything to gain from saying so. They are simply people who have lived near this place for a long time. The ranch itself, when you look at it in photographs or drone footage, is not dramatic in the way you might expect. There is a homestead area, a cluster of modest buildings, a farmhouse, some outbuildings. There is flat pasture land stretching out in most directions, fenced into sections for cattle, and then, in the northeastern portion of the property, there is the mesa, a flat-topped rise of land, roughly 100 feet above the valley floor, sitting quietly at the edge of the property. It does not look like much from a distance, but the mesa has become, over the course of decades of investigation, the single most anomalous area on the property. We will spend considerable time there later tonight. What makes Skinwalker Ranch unusual as a subject? What separates it from the general category of haunted places or UFO hotspots that you might find in any corner of the internet is the caliber and the variety of people who have taken it seriously. This is not a story that lives only in folklore communities or on the fringes of conspiracy culture. The people who have investigated this ranch include PhD-level scientists in biology, physics and chemistry. It includes a decorated aerospace engineer. It includes a former senator of the United States. It includes contractors working directly for the Defense Intelligence Agency. That is a particular kind of serious, and it deserves to be acknowledged plainly before anything else. This is not a horror story in the loud, theatrical sense. There are no monsters jumping out of the dark. There are no dramatic revelations. What there is, instead, is a slow and persistent accumulation of events. Events that have been witnessed, measured, photographed, and documented by people who arrived at the property as skeptics and left as something more complicated than that. Events that have continued across multiple owners, multiple research teams, and multiple decades. Events that have not resolved into a clean explanation and that have not gone away. The phenomena reported at the ranch span a remarkable range. Unidentified aerial objects tracked by multiple cameras simultaneously, cattle found dead with wounds of unusual precision, electromagnetic anomalies that instruments have detected but not explained, poltergeist-like activity inside the ranch buildings, physical effects experienced by people who spend extended time in certain areas of the property, apparent underground anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar, and, in some of the older accounts, something stranger still. Descriptions of things that do not fit neatly into any of the usual categories. We will go through each of these carefully, with as much specificity as the documented record allows. But the documented record begins with a family. A real family with children and cattle and a mortgage and ordinary hopes for a quiet life in the Utah countryside. Before the cameras arrived, before the government contracts were signed, before the book was written and the television series aired, there was a husband and wife who drove out to this piece of land in 1994, looked around at the flat valley and the wide sky, and decided to make it their home. What happened to them in the 2 years that followed is where this story really starts. And it is in many ways the most important part of the whole account, because they had no framework for what they experienced, no prior interest in the paranormal, no reason to fabricate anything, and ultimately no choice but to leave. A working ranching family, practical and grounded, driven off a piece of land they had paid $200,000 for by something they could not name and could not stop. Before the scientists came with their instruments, before the billionaire came with his funding, before any of the infrastructure of investigation was in place, there were just 2 people standing in a field in northeastern Utah, watching things they could not explain and feeling consistently and deeply that something on this land was watching them back. That is where we are going next. Terry and Gwen Sherman were not, by any account, unusual people. They were a ranching family from Utah, practical and straightforward, the kind of people who measure a good day by how much work got done before sundown. When they purchased the property in 1994 for approximately $200,000, they were not buying a mystery. They were buying land. Roughly 512 acres of grazing pasture in Winter County, with a farmhouse, some outbuildings, fencing that needed work in places, and enough room to run a proper cattle operation. The previous owners had apparently kept the place in reasonable shape. The Shermans arrived with their children, their animals, and the kind of quiet optimism that comes with starting something new. They had no particular interest in the paranormal. They had no prior connection to the land's reputation, if they were even aware that it had one. They were ranchers. They wanted to ranch. What happened in the weeks and months that followed has been described by Terry Sherman in interviews and later documented in detail by researchers and journalists, and it is worth going through carefully, not to sensationalize it, but because the specifics matter. The specifics are what separate this from a vague ghost story. Within days of moving onto the property, the Shermans noticed that something was wrong with their cattle. Not sick, not injured in any ordinary sense. Wrong in a way that was harder to categorize. The first instance involved cattle behaving strangely, becoming agitated without apparent cause, refusing to move into certain areas of the pasture that they had been perfectly willing to enter the day before. Animals have instincts that humans don't fully understand, and ranchers know this, so the Shermans paid attention. But it was the mutilations that made it impossible to dismiss. Cattle mutilations are a documented phenomenon across the American West, and they have been reported for decades in multiple states. The Shermans experienced them firsthand. Cattle found dead with wounds that did not look like the work of any predator they had ever encountered. The cuts were clean. Surgical is the word that gets used most often, and it is used because it is accurate. The edges of the wounds were precise in a way that a coyote or a mountain lion simply does not produce. In some cases, organs had been removed, specific organs consistently, without the surrounding tissue being torn or damaged in the way you would expect from an animal feeding. There was very little blood at the scenes. In some cases there appeared to be no blood at all, which is biologically difficult to explain for a large animal. And there were no tracks. Not just no human footprints, no animal tracks either, in soft ground that should have recorded something. Terry Sherman was a man who had spent his life around livestock and knew what predator damage looked like. He was not confused about the difference. What he found in his pastures did not match any explanation he had available to him, and that is worth sitting with for a moment. Because when a working rancher tells you that a dead cow does not look like anything he has seen before, that is a specific and grounded kind of testimony. It is not the testimony of someone who startles easily. The cattle losses were financially damaging. The Shermans were running a cattle operation, and cattle were dying in ways that made no sense and that left no trail to follow. But the mutilations were only part of what they were dealing with. There was the wolf. Terry Sherman described an encounter with a large wolf-like animal. Larger than any wolf he had seen, he said, and he had seen wolves. The animal approached the property calmly, without the wariness that wild predators typically show around humans and livestock. Sherman shot at it at close range, multiple times. The animal did not run, it did not fall. It appeared, by his account, completely unaffected, and then it simply walked away and disappeared into the landscape. He found no blood, no tracks, no evidence that the animal had been there at all. Now, a single account like that, standing alone, is easy to set aside, but it does not stand alone. It is part of a pattern that built week by week across the 2 years the Shermans lived on the property. Inside the farmhouse, things moved. Objects that had been left in one place were found in another. Not dramatic theatrical movement, not furniture thrown across rooms, but the quiet, disorienting kind of displacement that makes you question your own memory at first, and then, after it happens enough times, makes you stop questioning your memory and start questioning something else. Gwen Sherman reportedly experienced this more than once. The family described a general atmosphere inside the house that was difficult to name, a sense of presence, of being watched, of something paying attention to them that they could not see or locate. And then there were the lights. Terry Sherman described seeing lights in the sky above the property on multiple occasions. Not the distant, ambiguous kind of lights that could be aircraft or satellites or weather phenomena. Structured lights, he said, with apparent shape and deliberate movement. Coloured lights in some accounts. Objects that moved in ways that did not match the behaviour of any aircraft he recognised, and he was familiar enough with conventional aircraft to make that distinction. These sightings were not rare. They happened repeatedly, over the course of months. The Shermans were not the only people in the Uinta Basin reporting things like this. The region had a long history of aerial sightings going back well before 1994. But for the Shermans, the lights above their property felt personal. They felt connected to everything else that was happening on the land. What is perhaps most striking about the Sherman account, when you read through the documented interviews and the later research that drew on their testimony, is the emotional texture of it. Terry Sherman described feeling watched. Not occasionally, not in moments of particular strangeness, but consistently. A persistent background sense that the property was aware of them in some way, that their presence was being monitored by something they could not identify. That kind of sustained psychological pressure, maintained over months, is genuinely exhausting. It is the kind of thing that changes people. The Shermans endured this for approximately 2 years. 2 years is a long time to stay somewhere that is frightening you. People sometimes ask why they didn't leave sooner, and the answer is probably the same reason most people don't walk away from a $200,000 investment and a life they were trying to build. You hope it will stop, or you convince yourself it is not as bad as it seems, or you simply do not know where else to go. They were not wealthy people. The ranch was their livelihood. Leaving meant losing something significant, but they did leave. In 1996, the Shermans sold the property. The buyer was Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas real estate billionaire with a serious and long-standing interest in paranormal research. The sale price was reportedly around $200,000, roughly what the Shermans had paid 2 years earlier. They did not profit from the experience. They simply got out. The question that tends to follow people who hear the Sherman story for the first time is, why would they make this up? And it is a fair question to ask because it is the right instinct, to look for motive before accepting an extraordinary account. But the motive is genuinely difficult to construct here. The Shermans were not authors. They were not public figures. They did not seek media attention. They did not write a book or appear on television. They sold the ranch and largely retreated from public discussion of what had happened to them. Terry Sherman gave some interviews to journalists and researchers over the years, but he was not, by any account, someone who enjoyed the spotlight or who had anything obvious to gain from the story he was telling. The financial motive runs the wrong direction. They sold at the same price they bought, after 2 years of cattle losses and psychological strain. If the whole thing was fabricated, it was a remarkably unrewarding fabrication. What the Shermans' experience does, more than anything else, is establish a baseline. It establishes that the events associated with this property did not begin with television cameras or government contracts or funded research teams. They began with an ordinary family who moved onto ordinary-looking land and encountered something they had no language for and no way to stop. The ranch was doing whatever the ranch does before anyone arrived with instruments to measure it. There is something important in that. When researchers and scientists arrived in later years with their equipment and their methodologies, they were not creating the phenomena they were studying. The phenomena were already there. The Shermans are the evidence of that. Inconvenient, unpolished, practically minded evidence, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into a narrative but that is very hard to explain away. It is also worth noting what the Shermans did not report. They did not describe demonic presences or supernatural horror in the theatrical sense. They described specific physical-seeming events: a large animal that did not respond to bullets, cattle with surgical wounds, lights in the sky with apparent structure, objects displaced inside their home. These are strange things, genuinely strange things, but they are strange in a grounded way. They are the kind of strangeness that demands a physical explanation, not a metaphysical one. Or at least, that is where you start. The Shermans themselves did not reach for mystical frameworks. They were ranchers looking for practical answers to practical problems. They simply could not find any. The cattle mutilation aspect of their account is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it connects the Sherman experience to a much broader documented phenomenon that predates the ranch by decades. Unexplained cattle mutilations have been reported across the American West since at least the 1960s. The FBI investigated a wave of cases in the 1970s and produced a report in 1979 that concluded most cases could be explained by natural predation and decomposition. But the report also acknowledged cases that were more difficult to account for. Veterinary pathologists who have examined mutilated cattle have, in some documented instances, noted that the precision of certain wounds is inconsistent with known predator behaviour. The absence of blood is a particular sticking point. When a large animal dies, there is blood. When a predator feeds, there are signs, tracks, disturbed ground, scattered remains. The cases that have most puzzled investigators are the ones where none of these things are present. The Shermans' cattle fell into that category, and that places their experience within a phenomenon that is documented, contested, and genuinely unresolved. By the time the Shermans left in 1996, they had spent 2 years accumulating experiences that they could not explain, and that had cost them real money, real sleep, and something harder to quantify: the sense of safety that comes from living on land that feels like your own. The ranch had not felt like their own. It had felt consistently like somewhere else's territory, and they had never been able to determine whose. Robert Bigelow was waiting. He had, in fact, been in contact with the Shermans before the sale was finalised. He had heard about the property through channels that are not entirely clear, though the Interbasin's reputation for unusual events was not a secret in certain research communities. Bigelow was not buying a ranch to run cattle. He was buying a research site, and he was prepared to spend considerably more than $200,000 on what came next. The transition from the Sherman era to the Bigelow era is one of the more striking shifts in the ranch's history, because it marks the moment when the strangeness moved from the realm of personal testimony into the realm of funded, instrumented scientific investigation. The questions that the Shermans had experienced without any way to measure them were about to be approached by people with magnetometers and radiation detectors and night vision cameras and PhDs. Whether those tools would prove adequate to what the ranch had to offer is a different question entirely. But the effort was genuine, the funding was real, and what the researchers found over the years that followed is where the story gets considerably more complicated. Robert Bigelow is an interesting figure to sit with for a moment, because he does not fit the profile you might expect. He's not a fringe personality. He's not a conspiracy theorist operating out of a garage. He made his fortune in real estate, specifically in budget hotel chains, most notably Budget Suites of America, which by the mid-1990s had made him genuinely wealthy. He was, by most accounts, a sharp and practical businessman. And yet, alongside that career, he'd maintained a deep and serious interest in what he called frontier science. Questions about consciousness, about anomalous phenomena, about the nature of reality at its edges. He had lost a grandson in a car accident, and some who knew him suggest that loss deepened his interest in questions about what lies beyond ordinary experience. Whether that is the origin of his interest or simply part of the story, what matters here is that by 1995 and 1996, Bigelow was not dabbling. He was building infrastructure. He had already founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, known as NIDS, in 1995. The organisation was set up as a private, scientifically rigorous research body focused on anomalous phenomena, UAP, cattle mutilations, consciousness research and related areas. It was funded by Bigelow personally, and it was staffed with credentialed researchers, not enthusiasts, not hobbyists, people with advanced degrees in physics, biology, chemistry and related fields. The ambition of NIDS was to apply genuine scientific methodology to phenomena that mainstream science had largely declined to investigate. Bigelow believed that the reluctance of established institutions to study these things was a gap, and he intended to fill it. When word of the Sherman Ranch reached him, and the exact path of that information is not entirely clear, though researchers in the small world of anomalous phenomena tend to know each other, Bigelow moved quickly. He purchased the property in 1996 for approximately $200,000, which is the same price the Shermans had paid 2 years earlier. From a real estate perspective, it was a modest transaction for someone of Bigelow's resources. From a research perspective, it was an investment of a different kind entirely. What followed almost immediately was a significant physical transformation of the property. NIDS installed cameras across the ranch, not just a few, but a network designed to provide overlapping coverage of the land. Motion sensors were placed at various points. The ranch house was equipped with monitoring equipment. A team of researchers began rotating through the property on a near-continuous basis, living on site so that nothing would go unobserved simply because no one was present to observe it. The setup was, by the standards of private paranormal research, unusually serious. This was not a weekend investigation. This was a sustained, funded, professionally staffed research operation, and it ran for years. The core team was small but capable. Among the most prominent figures was Colm Kelleher, a biochemist who served as NIDS's deputy administrator, and who would later co-author the book that brought the ranch to wider public attention. Kelleher was not someone who arrived at this work from a background in fringe research. He had legitimate scientific credentials and had worked in mainstream molecular biology before joining NIDS. His presence on the team mattered, because it meant the research was being conducted by someone who understood how to design a study, evaluate evidence, and distinguish signal from noise, at least in principle. The researchers who lived on and around the ranch during the NIDS years kept detailed logs. They documented what they observed, when they observed it, and under what conditions, and what they observed, over the course of years, was strange enough that even now, reading through the accounts that have been made public, it is difficult to know exactly what to do with them. Orbs of light were among the most frequently documented phenomena. These were not distant lights in the sky that could be attributed to aircraft or stars or atmospheric effects. They were close. Some were described as moving with what appeared to be intelligence, changing direction, responding to the presence of observers, accelerating and decelerating in ways that did not match any obvious physical explanation. In at least some cases, these lights were captured on camera, though the quality of the footage was often frustrating. The kind of footage that shows something is there without being clear enough to show what it is. This is a recurring theme in the ranch's documented history, and it is genuinely maddening if you're trying to evaluate the evidence fairly. Cattle mutilations continued during the NIDS period. This is significant because it means the phenomenon did not stop, simply because scientists arrived. Whatever was happening to the cattle was not deterred by the presence of cameras or researchers or monitoring equipment. Cases were documented where cattle were found dead with the same characteristics that had troubled the Shermans. Precise wounds, no blood, no tracks, no evidence of predation in the conventional sense. NIDS researchers collected tissue samples and submitted them for laboratory analysis. Some of those results were published in a limited way. Others remained internal. The full picture of what the laboratory work showed has never been entirely made public, which is a source of ongoing frustration for independent researchers who would like to evaluate the data. Equipment malfunctions were a regular occurrence on the property. This might sound like a minor detail, but it matters because the equipment involved was not cheap or fragile. Cameras would fail without explanation. recording devices would stop working in specific areas of the ranch and then resume functioning normally when moved elsewhere. Batteries would drain at unusual rates. This kind of equipment behaviour is reported frequently enough across different investigators and different eras of research at the ranch that it has become one of its more consistent documented features. Whether it is caused by some localised electromagnetic effect or something else entirely, or simply by the ordinary unreliability of electronics in outdoor environments, that is genuinely unclear. But the consistency of the reports across many different observers is worth noting. There is at least one account from the NIDS period that has attracted particular attention. A researcher on the property reported observing a large, unidentified creature, not a wolf, not a bear, something that did not match any known animal in the region. The creature was described as unusually large and as behaving in a way that did not match any normal animal behaviour. This account echoes what the Shermans had described years earlier, which is either evidence of a consistent phenomenon or evidence of a consistent narrative being passed between people who knew the ranch's history. Evaluating that is genuinely difficult, and it is important to say so rather than pretend the ambiguity does not exist. What is perhaps most striking about the NIDS operation is how quiet it was. Bigelow did not call press conferences. NIDS did not seek media coverage. The organisation published some of its findings in a limited way. There were reports, some of which circulated in research communities, and a few papers touched on aspects of what had been observed, but the bulk of the work was kept internal. For most of the late 1990s and early 2000s, the general public had no idea that a funded scientific investigation of this scope was running at a ranch in northeastern Utah. This was not a secret in the conspiratorial sense. NIDS was not hiding from the government or operating illegally. It was simply private. Bigelow was spending his own money on research he considered important, and he did not feel obligated to share every detail with the world. This quietness is itself interesting, because it runs counter to what you might expect from someone trying to generate publicity or profit from a paranormal narrative. If the goal had been to sell a story, keeping the research internal for years would be a strange way to do it. The more you look at the NIDS operation, the more it resembles a genuine attempt to do science in a difficult environment rather than a performance designed to attract attention. That said, NIDS was not without its limitations. The organisation operated outside the peer review system that governs mainstream science. Its findings were not subjected to independent replication in any formal sense. The researchers on site were aware of the ranch's history before they arrived, which creates the possibility, not the certainty but the possibility, that expectation shaped perception. These are real methodological concerns, and they are worth holding on to alongside the data. The honest position is that NIDS produced a body of observations that is genuinely difficult to dismiss and genuinely difficult to verify. Both things are true at the same time. There is also the question of what NIDS concluded, to whatever extent they reached conclusions. The organisation was cautious in its public statements. Kelleher and others who were involved have said, in various interviews and writings over the years, that the phenomena at the ranch were real in the sense that they registered on instruments and were observed by multiple credentialed people. But they were also deeply resistant to explanation. The phenomena did not behave consistently enough to be pinned down. They did not repeat on demand. They did not leave behind the kind of clean, reproducible evidence that science requires in order to build a solid case. They were, in the words that keep appearing in accounts from this period, elusive, not absent, elusive. This elusiveness is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the ranch, and it becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. The phenomena, whatever they are, appear to have been present consistently enough to be observed and documented across years of sustained investigation, but they have also consistently resisted the kind of definitive capture that would resolve the question one way or another. Some researchers have noted that this pattern, consistent presence, consistent elusiveness, is itself a kind of data point. It suggests that whatever is happening at the ranch is not random noise. Random noise would occasionally produce a clear result. The consistent failure to produce a clear result across years of careful observation might be telling us something. What exactly it is telling us is the harder question. By the time NIDS wound down its operations at the ranch in the early 2000s, the organisation itself was formally dissolved in 2004. The research team had accumulated years of logs, footage, instrument readings and field notes. Some of that material fed directly into the book that Kelleher and journalist George Knapp were already preparing. Some of it remained archived in ways that have not been fully made public. And some of it, presumably, made its way into conversations with people in government and intelligence communities who had their own reasons for being interested in what was happening in the Uinta Basin. Because here is the thing that tends to get lost in the more sensational coverage of Skinwalker Ranch. The NIDS years were not just a private research project. They were also a period during which the ranch was developing a reputation in certain corners of the defense and intelligence world. Bigelow had connections in those communities. He had testified to Congress about UAP. He had relationships with figures in the military and intelligence establishment who took the subject seriously, even if they could not say so publicly. The ranch was not invisible to those people. It was, in fact, becoming something of a reference point, a location that kept coming up in discussions about anomalous phenomena, a place where the strangeness seemed to concentrate in ways that resisted easy dismissal. The full weight of that government attention would not become public for another decade. The contracts, the program names, the dollar figures, those would come later. But the groundwork was being laid during the NIDS years, quietly, in the way that serious things sometimes develop before anyone is ready to talk about them openly. What Bigelow had done in purchasing and instrumenting the ranch was create a bridge between the era of personal testimony, the Shermans' 2 years of lived experience, and something more structured and more consequential. The ranch was no longer just a place where strange things happened to ordinary people. It was now a place where strange things happened to scientists with recording equipment, and where those scientists' findings were being noted by people with security clearances and budget authority. That is a different kind of story, and it was about to become considerably more visible. The book that Kelleher and Knapp were preparing would see to that. George Knapp is not the kind of journalist who chases ghosts. That is worth saying plainly because the name Skinwalker Ranch has attracted its share of people who very much are that kind of journalist. People who arrive with a conclusion already in hand and work backward from it. Knapp is different. He spent years as an investigative reporter in Las Vegas, breaking stories on organized crime, government corruption, and defense contracting. He won a Peabody Award. He is the reporter who first brought Bob Lazar's claims about Area 51 to public attention in 1989, which is either a mark against him or a mark in his favour, depending on where you stand on that particular rabbit hole. But the point is that he had a career built on verification and sourcing, not on credulity. When Knapp began working with Colm Kelleher on what would become Hunt for the Skinwalker, he brought that background with him. And Kelleher brought something equally important. He was a biochemist with a doctorate from Trinity College Dublin, and he had spent years as one of the primary on-site researchers for NIDS. He had been at the ranch. He had seen things. He had also taken notes, kept logs, and tried to apply scientific discipline to an environment that resisted it at almost every turn. The book was published in 2005, and it changed the public conversation about the ranch in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. Before Hunt for the Skinwalker, the property was known mainly in UFO research circles and among people who followed paranormal news closely. After it, the ranch had a document, a long, sourced, carefully written account that someone could hold in their hands and read from beginning to end. That matters more than it might seem. A lot of paranormal claims exist in a kind of fog. Rumours, forum posts, second-hand accounts, things someone's cousin said. A book is different. A book has an author who put their name on it. a publisher who decided it was worth printing, and a structure that allows the reader to evaluate the argument being made. Hunt for the Skinwalker was that kind of document. It was not perfect, and we will get to the limitations, but it was serious in a way that raised the conversation to a different level. What the book actually contains is worth going through in some detail, because the specific claims are more interesting than the general reputation would suggest. One of the most discussed accounts in the book involves what Kelleher and Knapp describe as a luminous tunnel or portal, a roughly circular opening of yellowish light that was observed in a field on the property. The account comes from NIDS researchers who were on site at the time. According to their description, the opening appeared to expand over a period of several minutes, and what they saw emerging from it was described as a large, dark creature, something that moved on all fours but was not immediately identifiable as any known animal. The creature, according to the account, moved away from the light and disappeared into the darkness of the field. The portal, or whatever it was, then closed. Now, that is an extraordinary claim, and Kelleher and Knapp present it as such. They do not announce it as proof of interdimensional travel or supernatural visitation. They present it as what it is, a detailed account from trained observers who were not expecting what they saw and who wrote it down immediately afterward. The book's handling of this kind of material is consistently careful in this way. It does not reach for dramatic conclusions. It describes what was reported and then sits with the uncertainty. This is frankly a more intellectually honest approach than either the true believer treatment or the flat dismissal that these accounts usually receive. The poltergeist-type activity described in the book is perhaps less cinematic than the portal account, but in some ways it is more interesting precisely because it is so mundane. Objects moved inside the ranch house in ways that had no apparent physical cause. Tools left in one location were found in another. There were sounds, heavy, deliberate sounds that had no identifiable source. Kelleher describes one incident in which a heavy piece of equipment was found, repositioned overnight in a way that would have required multiple people and significant effort to accomplish. No one had been near it. The cameras that NIDS had installed to monitor the property had, on that particular night, malfunctioned. This is a pattern that comes up repeatedly in the book and in subsequent accounts. The phenomena and the equipment failures tend to coincide. Whether that is meaningful or coincidental is one of the questions the book leaves open. The cattle mutilation accounts in Hunt for the Skinwalker are among the most carefully documented sections. Kelleher, as a biochemist, was well positioned to examine the physical evidence, and he does so with a level of technical detail that is unusual in this kind of literature. The wounds on the affected animals showed characteristics that are difficult to explain through conventional predation. The cuts were clean in a way that suggested something sharper and more controlled than teeth or claws. There was consistently very little blood at the scene, which is strange given the nature of the injuries. In some cases, specific organs had been removed, the eyes, the tongue, reproductive organs, with a precision that Kelleher describes as surgical in character. He is careful not to say that the wounds were made by surgical instruments. He says they have the characteristics of surgical work. That distinction is important. He is describing what he observed, not asserting a cause. The absence of tracks is another recurring detail. In soft soil, around animals that had clearly been killed and processed in the field, there were no footprints. Not human, not animal. Whatever had done this had either approached through the air, or had been careful in a way that no known predator is careful, or, and this is the skeptical explanation, the tracks had been obscured by the time investigators arrived. All three possibilities are real. The book does not pretend otherwise. Knapp's journalistic voice runs through the book in a way that keeps it grounded even when the material is at its most strange. There is a chapter in which he describes his own first visit to the ranch during the Miwa Minoids period. The feeling of being watched, the flatness of the landscape, the way the mesa sits on the northeastern edge of the property with a kind of impassive presence. He is not performing fear. He is describing a place that made him pay attention in a way he had not expected. That quality, the honest admission that something about this location affects how you feel when you are there, runs through a lot of the first-hand accounts in the book, from researchers who came in as skeptics and left with more questions than they arrived with. It is worth pausing here to think about what the book is actually doing, structurally. Hunt for the Skinwalker is not arguing that Skinwalker Ranch is haunted, or that aliens are visiting, or that any specific supernatural explanation is correct. It is arguing that something is happening at this location that does not fit neatly into the categories that mainstream science currently offers. That is a narrower and more defensible claim than it is usually given credit for. The book is essentially saying, here are the observations, here are the people who made them, here are the instruments that registered anomalies, and here is the fact that we do not have a clean explanation. That is an honest position. It is also, for some readers, an unsatisfying one. We tend to want books to arrive somewhere. Hunt for the Skinwalker arrives at a question, not an answer, and that requires a certain kind of patience to sit with. The response to the book was interesting in itself. Within the UFO and paranormal research community, it was treated as a landmark document, the most serious and comprehensive account of the ranch that had ever been published. Outside that community, it received relatively little mainstream attention. A few skeptical writers noted the reliance on witness testimony and the lack of peer-reviewed data. Some dismissed it as credulous journalism dressed up in scientific language, but it did not get the kind of sustained critical engagement that a book making similarly extraordinary claims in a different domain might have received. It was, in a sense, placed in a category, paranormal, that allowed mainstream culture to ignore it without having to engage with its specific arguments. That's a comfortable way to handle uncomfortable material. What the book did accomplish, regardless of how it was received, was to create a stable, accessible record of the ranch's history up to that point. Before 2005, the story of Skinwalker Ranch existed in fragments. The Sherman's interviews, the NIDS internal reports, the articles that had appeared in UFO publications. After 2005, there was a single document that anyone could read that laid out the chronology, the personnel, the specific incidents, and the general shape of what had been investigated and found. That kind of consolidation matters. It meant that future researchers, journalists and investigators had a common reference point. It meant that the conversation could move forward instead of constantly relitigating the basic facts. There is also a detail about the book's reception that tends to get overlooked, which is that it was not ignored by everyone in positions of authority. People in the defense and intelligence communities who were already aware of the ranch's reputation read it. Some of them had been following the NIDS work for years. The book made the case for the ranch's significance in a form that was now publicly available, which in some ways made it easier to discuss in settings where citing classified briefings would have been impossible. Whether that influenced subsequent government interest in the property is difficult to say with certainty, but the timeline is suggestive. The book appeared in 2005. The government program that would eventually direct $22 million toward research that included the ranch was launched in 2007. 2 years is not a long gap. Kelleher has spoken in interviews about the experience of writing the book and about what it felt like to have spent years investigating a phenomenon that consistently refused to be pinned down. He has described a kind of professional frustration that is distinct from disbelief. He clearly believes that something real was happening at the ranch, but he is equally clear that the scientific tools available to him were not adequate to the task of explaining it. This is a position that is easy to caricature from either direction. The true believer reads it as confirmation that the phenomena are beyond science. The skeptic reads it as an admission that the evidence is insufficient. What it actually is, if you take it at face value, is the honest account of a trained scientist who encountered something he could not explain, and had the intellectual honesty to say so rather than forcing the data into a comfortable framework. The book's title, Hunt for the Skinwalker, does something interesting in itself. It frames the investigation as a hunt, a pursuit, while the subject of that hunt is the Skinwalker, a figure drawn from indigenous tradition, rather than from science fiction or modern mythology. That framing connects the scientific investigation to a much older layer of meaning, one that the Ute people of the Uinta Basin had been carrying long before any researcher with a magnetometer arrived on the property. The title is not just a marketing choice, it points towards something that the book itself addresses, which is the question of what this place meant to the people who knew it before the Shermans, before Bigelow, before NIDS. The people for whom this land was not a research site but a place to be avoided, a place that had its own history of strangeness, reaching back further than any written record. That older layer of the story is one that the book touches on but does not fully explore. It is a thread that deserves more careful attention, and it reaches back into the land itself in ways that the scientific instruments were never designed to measure. That older layer begins not with a purchase price or a research contract or a television crew. It begins with the land itself, and with the people who understood it long before anyone thought to install a camera on it. The Uinta Basin has been Ute territory for centuries. The Ute people, whose name gives the state of Utah its name, which is a detail worth pausing on for a moment, have lived in this high desert region of northeastern Utah through cycles of season and hardship that stretch back far beyond the written record. The basin is their homeland in a deep practical sense. They knew its water sources, its hunting grounds, its weather patterns, its places of shelter, and its places of danger. And among the places they knew, the land that would eventually become Skinwalker Ranch was one they regarded with particular caution. Not casual caution, something more serious than that. The Ute oral tradition holds that this specific area of the basin is a place to be avoided. The accounts vary in their details, as oral traditions naturally do across generations and across different speakers, but the consistent thread is that the land carries something, a quality, a history, a kind of presence, that makes it unsuitable for ordinary habitation or use. Some accounts connect this specifically to a conflict with the Navajo people and to the figure of the Skinwalker. It is worth being careful here about what the Skinwalker actually is in indigenous tradition, because the word gets used loosely in popular culture in ways that strip it of its original meaning. In Navajo belief, and in related traditions among the Ute, a Skinwalker is a witch, a practitioner of harmful magic who has gained the ability to transform into animal form. The Navajo term is Yinaldlushi, which translates roughly as "with it, he goes on all fours." This is not a figure of adventure or entertainment. In the cultures where this belief is held, the Skinwalker is regarded with genuine fear and is not something that is discussed lightly or in casual company. Many Navajo people today are reluctant to speak about skinwalkers with outsiders, not because they think outsiders will laugh at them, but because talking about such things is understood to carry its own risks. There is a real cultural weight here that the name Skinwalker Ranch carries, whether or not the people who use that name are fully aware of it. The connection between the Skinwalker figure and the Uinta Basin land comes through accounts suggesting that the area was the site of some historical conflict, possibly a curse placed upon the land by Navajo practitioners against the Ute, or possibly something that predates that specific conflict and simply became associated with Skinwalker activity over time. The details are not fully recoverable from the outside, and it would be wrong to claim more precision than the sources actually offer. What can be said is that the Ute avoidance of this specific piece of land is documented in accounts collected from Ute community members, and that it is old. Not old in the sense of a few generations, old in the sense that no one can clearly identify when it began, which suggests it has been part of the cultural understanding of this place for a very long time. What makes this worth sitting with, rather than simply noting and moving on, is the specificity of it. The Ute did not regard the entire Uinta Basin as a place of danger. They lived in the basin, hunted in it, travelled through it. It was this particular area, this particular stretch of land in what is now Winter County, that carried the warning. That level of geographic specificity is not nothing. It is the kind of detail that is easy to dismiss as coincidence or as retroactive mythologizing, but it is also the kind of detail that becomes more interesting when you consider that the specific area the Ute identified as problematic is the same area where, a century or more later, a family would report strange experiences within days of arriving, where a funded scientific team would install monitoring equipment and register unexplained anomalies, and where the United States government would eventually direct significant research funding. The same patch of ground. That is either a remarkable coincidence or it is a signal worth taking seriously. The name itself is a piece of evidence of a kind. The researchers who came to investigate the ranch in the 1990s and 2000s did not invent the term Skinwalker for marketing purposes. They adopted it from the local indigenous knowledge that was already attached to this land. George Knapp, who is a careful journalist by training and disposition, has spoken about how the name came from conversations with Ute community members who used it in connection with this specific area. The name was already there. It was already part of the landscape. The investigators simply recognized that it was pointing at something. There is also the broader UFO history of the Uinta Basin that predates the Sherman family's arrival by decades. This is a part of the story that does not always get the attention it deserves, because the focus tends to fall on the dramatic events of the 1990s and afterward. But sightings of unusual aerial phenomena in the Uinta Basin go back at least to the 1950s and 1960s, and possibly earlier. Local residents in the area around Ballard and Fort Duchesne reported lights in the sky, structured objects moving in ways that conventional aircraft could not, and other anomalies long before the Shermans purchased the ranch. Some of these accounts were collected by early UFO researchers and appear in the records of organisations like APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation, which was active during that period. They are not elaborate or dramatic accounts. They are the kind of brief, matter-of-fact reports that working people in rural areas make when they see something they cannot explain, not because they are seeking attention, but because the experience was real, and they noted it. The Uinta Basin also sits within a broader region of Utah that has produced an unusual concentration of UAP reports over the decades. Researchers who have mapped sighting reports across the American West have noted that northeastern Utah appears as a cluster point, a place where reports are more dense than the surrounding geography would predict based on population alone. There are not enough people in this part of Utah to statistically account for the volume of unusual sightings that have come from it. That disproportion is itself a data point, though what it means is genuinely unclear. One explanation sometimes offered is geological. The Uinta Basin sits at the intersection of several significant geological features. The Uinta Mountains to the north are one of the only major mountain ranges in North America that runs east-west rather than north-south, which is a geological anomaly in itself. The basin is rich in natural resources: oil, natural gas, gilsonite, a rare form of natural asphalt found almost nowhere else in the world. The geology is complex, layered, and in some areas geologically active in ways that are not always apparent from the surface. Some researchers have proposed that unusual geological conditions, specific mineral compositions, fault line activity, underground gas deposits, or electromagnetic properties of the rock, could produce effects that might be experienced as anomalous by people on the surface. This is a hypothesis we will return to in more detail later, but it is relevant here because the geological strangeness of the basin is not a modern invention. It was known to the people who lived there. Whether the Ute connected the unusual properties of this land to what they understood as skinwalker activity, or whether the two things are simply coincident, is not something anyone can say with confidence. What the indigenous history of this place does, very usefully, is push the timeline back. Every time someone encounters the story of Skinwalker Ranch for the first time, the natural tendency is to locate the beginning of the strangeness at a specific modern moment. The Shermans' arrival in 1994, or Bigelow's purchase in 1996, or the publication of Knapp and Kelleher's book in 2005. But the Ute oral tradition makes clear that the beginning, if there is one, is nowhere near that recent. Whatever has been happening at this location has been noticed by human beings for long enough that it became part of a culture's inherited knowledge about the landscape, the kind of knowledge that gets passed down not as a curiosity, but as a practical warning. Stay away from that place. It is not safe. This is the kind of knowledge that communities preserve because it has proven useful, not because it makes a good story. It is also worth noting, gently, that the Ute community's relationship to the ranch's modern fame is complicated. The name Skinwalker Ranch and the television series and the books and the investigations have brought a great deal of outside attention to something that the Ute people regard as serious, culturally sensitive, and not really anyone else's business. Some members of the Ute community have expressed discomfort with the way their traditions have been appropriated and commercialized by the ranch's public story. That is a reasonable and fair concern. The figure of the Skinwalker is not a piece of folklore available for general use. It comes from a living tradition held by living people, and the casual way it gets deployed in popular culture, including to some extent in the name of the ranch itself, does not always reflect that. At the same time, the Ute knowledge about this land is part of the evidentiary record, in the broadest sense. If you're trying to understand what this place is and why it seems to produce such a consistent pattern of unusual experiences across such a wide range of observers and time periods, then you cannot responsibly ignore the oldest observers. The Ute people were paying attention to this land before any scientist arrived with instruments, and what they concluded was that something about it required serious caution. That conclusion was not reached quickly or carelessly. It was reached through long experience, and it was preserved carefully enough to survive into the present. That is not proof of anything specific, but it is data of a kind, and it belongs in any honest account of this place. There is a phrase that comes up sometimes in conversations about indigenous ecological knowledge and traditional environmental knowledge more broadly, which is that these knowledge systems often encode real information about the natural world, in forms that Western science is only beginning to learn how to read. Communities that have lived in a landscape for generations develop an understanding of its patterns, its flood cycles, its animal behaviours, its dangerous plants, its geologically unstable areas, that can be extraordinarily precise even when it is expressed in cultural or spiritual rather than scientific terms. The warning to avoid the land that would become Skinwalker Ranch may encode something real about the physical properties of that location, or it may encode a historical event, a conflict, a tragedy, an experience of strangeness that occurred there long ago and was preserved in the form of a cultural prohibition. Either possibility is worth taking seriously. What the Ute history adds to the overall picture of Skinwalker Ranch is something that the scientific investigations, for all their instruments and methodology, cannot provide on their own, which is depth. The NIDS cameras were installed in 1996. The BAAS-S program ran from 2007 onward. The television series began in 2019. But the Ute knowledge of this place as something unusual goes back further than any of that by generations. The strangeness here, whatever it is not a recent development. It is not a product of modern attention or modern expectation. It was here before the cameras, before the scientists, before the Shermans, before the first European settlers arrived in the basin. That is a long time for a place to be consistently regarded as unusual, and it raises a question that the scientific data alone cannot fully answer, which is whether the thing that is happening at this location is something that human instruments are even capable of fully capturing. The government apparently thought it was worth trying. 2 years after Hunt for the Skinwalker placed the ranch's story in the public record, a classified program was quietly launched that would direct more funding toward investigating this patch of Utah desert than most people would ever guess. The amount was not small. The agencies involved were not fringe organizations, and the ranch, this same 512 acres of red rock and sagebrush in Winter County that the Ute had been warning people about for generations, sat at the center of it. In 2007, something shifted. Not on the ranch itself, not in any way that was immediately visible, but in Washington. A program was quietly authorized within the Defense Intelligence Agency, given the name Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, and assigned the kind of funding that signals genuine institutional seriousness. The amount allocated was $22 million over 5 years. The program's stated purpose was to study advanced aerospace threats, unidentified craft, anomalous phenomena, things that American military and intelligence personnel were encountering and could not explain. And one of the primary physical locations that this program would focus its attention on was a 512-acre ranch in Uintah County, Utah, that most of the people who authorized the funding had probably never visited. That is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is easy to let a number like $22 million pass by without really registering what it means in context. This was not a small exploratory grant. This was not a university research budget. $22 million directed by the Defense Intelligence Agency toward a program that treated Skinwalker Ranch as a serious subject of national security interest. Whatever skepticism one might bring to the ranch's more dramatic claims, that fact sits outside the realm of folklore or wishful thinking. It is documented, it is part of the public record, confirmed through investigative journalism, Freedom of Information Act requests, and eventually by the people involved. The program was called AAWSAP, and it was distinct from, though related to, a more commonly known program called AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which became public in 2017 through reporting by the New York Times. The relationship between the two programs is somewhat tangled, and different people who were involved describe the overlap differently. But what is clear is that AAWSAP was the larger, more comprehensive program, and that it was administered not by a government agency directly, but through a private contract awarded to a company called Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, known by the acronym BAASS, and BAASS was Robert Bigelow's company. The same Robert Bigelow who had purchased the ranch in 1996 and spent a decade funding the NIDS investigation there. This is one of those details that, when you first encounter it, sounds almost too convenient to be real. The man who owned the ranch won the government contract to investigate the kinds of phenomena the ranch was known for, and then used the ranch as a primary research site under that contract. It reads like a conflict of interest, or possibly like a very elaborate arrangement. Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and who had a long-standing interest in UAP research, was instrumental in securing the funding for AAWSAP. Reid had known Bigelow for years and considered him a serious researcher in this area. Whether that relationship influenced the contracting process is a question that different observers answer differently. What is not in dispute is that the contract was awarded, the money was spent, and Skinwalker Ranch was central to the work that followed. Harry Reid's involvement is itself worth noting more carefully. Reid was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most powerful politicians in the country during the period when this program was funded. He later spoke publicly about his support for UAP research, and he was clear that he believed the subject deserved serious government attention. In an interview he gave before his death in 2021, Reid said that he had no regrets about pushing for the funding, and that he believed the United States needed to understand what its military personnel were encountering in the air. He mentioned Skinwalker Ranch specifically as a place that had produced evidence worth investigating. That is a former Senate Majority Leader saying on record that a ranch in rural Utah warranted classified government attention. That is not nothing. Under the BAASS contract, the investigation at Skinwalker Ranch became significantly more resourced and more structured than anything the NIDS team had been able to mount in the earlier years. Personnel were deployed to the ranch on a rotating basis. The monitoring infrastructure was expanded. Investigators with backgrounds in physics, biology, psychology, and military intelligence were brought in to examine what was happening on the property. The scope of the investigation, according to accounts from people who worked within the program, was broader than most people realise. AWSAP was not simply studying UAP sightings, it was studying a range of anomalous phenomena, things that didn't fit neatly into any single category. And the ranch was treated as a kind of laboratory for that broader inquiry. Colm Kelleher, the biochemist who had co-authored Hunt for the Skinwalker and spent years working with NIDS, was involved in the BAASS operation as well. His account of the ranch, already detailed in the 2005 book, informed the priorities of the new investigation. James Lakatsky, a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, was another key figure. He had visited the ranch and reportedly witnessed something there that convinced him the location warranted serious government attention. Lakatsky later co-authored a book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, published in 2021, which provides an account of the AAWSAP program from the inside. The book is careful, and its authors are aware of how the subject is perceived, but it is direct about the conclusion they reached, that the phenomena documented at Skinwalker Ranch were real, were anomalous, and were not explained by any conventional framework. What makes the BAASS period particularly interesting is not just the funding or the personnel, but the way the ranch was conceptualized within the program. According to multiple accounts, investigators working under AAWSAP came to regard Skinwalker Ranch not simply as a place where strange things happened, but as a kind of focal point, a location where anomalous activity was concentrated in a way that suggested something systematic rather than random. The phrase that gets used repeatedly by people who work there under the government contract and by independent researchers who have studied the documentation is that the ranch behaves like a hotspot. Not in the casual sense, but in a more specific sense. A place where the frequency and variety of anomalous events exceeds what would be expected by chance, and where that excess has been observed across different time periods, different investigators, and different types of instrumentation. That framing matters because it changes what the ranch is, scientifically speaking. If Skinwalker Ranch were simply a location where credulous people reported unusual experiences, it would be interesting but not particularly significant. There are many such places. What separates this location, or what the people who have studied it most carefully argue separates it, is the instrumented data. Magnetometers registered anomalies, radiation detectors registered anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar later produced readings that suggested unusual subsurface features. These are not eyewitness accounts, they are instrument readings, and instrument readings don't get nervous or excited or confused by suggestion. They either register something or they don't. The fact that instruments at Skinwalker Ranch have registered things that researchers cannot explain is a separate category of evidence from the witness testimony, and it is the category that the government program took most seriously. It is also worth being honest about what the BAASS program did not produce, because fairness requires that too. The program ran from 2008 to 2012, when the DIA contract ended. In those years, for all the resources and personnel and instrumentation deployed, no definitive physical evidence of a non-human craft or entity was recovered from the ranch. No phenomenon was captured in a form that allowed for controlled replication or peer-reviewed analysis. The anomalies that were documented remained anomalies. Things that happened were recorded in some form and then resisted explanation. That is a frustrating outcome if you're hoping for a clean answer, and it is the kind of outcome that skeptics point to as evidence that the phenomena, whatever their ultimate source, are not the kind of thing that scientific investigation can pin down. But there is another way to read that outcome. Some of the researchers who worked on AWSAP have suggested that the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch appear to respond to observation, that the presence of investigators and instruments seems to influence what occurs in ways that make controlled study extremely difficult. This is a deeply strange claim, and it is one that sits uncomfortably in any conventional scientific framework. It sounds, on the surface, like a convenient excuse for why the investigation didn't produce cleaner results, but it is also a claim that keeps coming up independently from people with serious scientific credentials who spent extended time on the property. Kelleher has mentioned it. Other researchers have mentioned it. The idea that whatever is happening at the ranch is in some sense interactive, that it is aware of being studied, is one of the more unsettling threads in the entire story, and it is one that the BAASS program never fully resolved. The program wound down in 2012, and with it the formal government investment in the ranch as a research site. But the information gathered during those years did not disappear. It fed into the broader UAP conversation that was slowly building within certain parts of the US government, and it contributed to the eventual public acknowledgement in 2017, and then more formally in subsequent years, that unidentified aerial phenomena were real, were being observed by military personnel, and were not explained. The path from Skinwalker Ranch to the 2017 New York Times story that broke the AATIP program into public consciousness is not a straight line, but it is a real one. The government's serious engagement with UAP as a subject did not begin in a vacuum. It was built in part on years of investigation that included this ranch, this basin, this stretch of land in northeastern Utah that the Ute had been warning people about long before any defense contractor arrived with a budget. There is something almost vertiginous about that chain of events when you hold it all together. A family buys a ranch in 1994 and experiences things they cannot explain. A billionaire buys the property in 1996 and installs scientists. A book is published in 2005 that brings the story to a wider audience. A classified government program is funded in 2007, partly on the basis of what has been documented at this location. That program runs for 5 years with $22 million and the involvement of Defense Intelligence Agency analysts, and the phenomena throughout all of it remain unexplained. The investigation doesn't resolve the mystery, it deepens it. It adds layers of institutional seriousness to what might otherwise be dismissed as rural folklore, and it leaves behind a record, partial, imperfect, contested, that subsequent researchers are still trying to make sense of. What the AAAW-SAP period ultimately confirmed, if it confirmed anything, is that the strangeness at Skinwalker Ranch is not a local rumour that evaporates under scrutiny. It is something that survives scrutiny, not by producing proof, but by continuing to produce anomalies that serious investigators cannot account for. The government program did not debunk the ranch. It did not find a mundane explanation for the cattle mutilations, the instrument readings, the accounts of unusual craft and lights and entities. It found, instead, that the phenomena were real enough to warrant continued attention, and complex enough to resist any simple framework. That is the honest summary of what the most serious, best-funded investigation of Skinwalker Ranch ever conducted actually found. Not proof, not debunking. Something more frustrating and more interesting than either. A genuine accumulation of anomalous data that points towards something real without revealing what that something is. The BAASS contract ended. Robert Bigelow moved on to other projects, and the ranch sat quietly for a few years in a kind of investigative limbo. Still strange, presumably, still accumulating whatever it accumulates, but without the organised scientific presence that had been monitoring it. That period of quiet did not last particularly long. By the mid-2010s, a new owner was in the process of acquiring the property, someone who would eventually bring it back into public view in a way that the NIDS era and the government program never quite managed. The cameras that would arrive with the next chapter would be a different kind of camera entirely, not scientific monitoring equipment, but television production equipment. And the audience that would watch what they captured would number not in the dozens of cleared government analysts, but in the millions. What the History Channel would make of Skinwalker Ranch and what Skinwalker Ranch would make of the History Channel is a story with its own complications and its own genuinely surprising moments. And it begins with a real estate developer from Utah who kept his new purchase very quiet for several years. So let us slow down for a moment and actually look at what the investigators were doing on the ground during those years. because it is easy to talk about NIDS and BAASS in broad strokes, the funding, the credentials, the government contract, without stopping to ask what the day-to-day scientific work actually looked like. What instruments were they using? What did the readings say? And what, specifically, did they find that they could not explain away? The monitoring setup that NIDS established in the late 1990s was more serious than most people imagine when they first hear about it. This was not a group of enthusiasts with handheld cameras wandering around at night hoping to catch something on video. The team deployed magnetometers to measure fluctuations in the local magnetic field. They used radiation detectors, Geiger counters, and more sensitive instruments capable of detecting gamma radiation and other forms of ionizing radiation. They had night vision cameras positioned at fixed points across the property, motion activated, running continuously. Soil samples were collected from areas where unusual events had been reported. In some cases, the team used ground-penetrating radar to look at what was beneath certain parts of the property. The approach was, as much as possible, the approach of a field science team doing environmental monitoring. The goal was to capture something measurable, something that existed in the physical world as data rather than just as testimony, and they did capture things. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the broader debate about whether the ranch is real or theatre. The instruments registered anomalies, not constantly, not on demand, but repeatedly enough over the years of monitoring that the researchers considered them significant. Radiation readings were one of the more consistent findings. In certain areas of the property, detectors registered spikes in radiation levels that did not correspond to any obvious local source. These were not massive spikes and not the kind of readings that would indicate immediate danger, but they were elevated above baseline in ways that were difficult to attribute to natural background variation. The spikes tended to occur in areas that were also associated with other reported phenomena, which made them harder to dismiss as instrument error or geological coincidence. Whether they were a cause of the reported experiences, a byproduct of something else, or genuinely unrelated to the other anomalies, is something the NIDS team was never able to determine. But they were there, and they were documented. Electromagnetic readings were similarly unusual in certain locations. Magnetometers on the property registered fluctuations that did not match known sources of electromagnetic interference. There were no large power lines running through the area, no industrial equipment nearby that might account for the readings. The fluctuations were localized. They appeared in specific areas of the property and not uniformly across it, which is exactly the kind of pattern that suggests a real physical source rather than instrument noise. Some of the strongest readings were associated with an area in the northeastern portion of the ranch, near an elevated section of land that would later become the focus of much more intensive investigation. At the time, the NIDS team noted the readings and continued monitoring. The source remained unidentified. Soil analysis produced some findings that were hard to interpret. In areas where unusual lights or craft had been reported hovering close to the ground, soil samples sometimes showed evidence of compaction and chemical changes that were not typical of the surrounding terrain. In a few cases, the compaction patterns were roughly circular, which is consistent with some kind of downward pressure applied from above. This is the kind of physical trace evidence that investigators in the UAP field have been looking for since the 1960s, and it is exactly the kind of evidence that is difficult to evaluate because it requires ruling out a very long list of mundane explanations before anything more unusual can be considered. The NIDS researchers did attempt to rule out mundane explanations. Whether they succeeded is a matter of ongoing debate, but the effort was made. The cattle mutilations deserve their own careful look, because they are one of the most concrete and physically verifiable aspects of the ranch's history. The Shermans experienced them. The NIDS team documented continued incidents during their tenure, and the physical characteristics of the mutilations were consistent enough across multiple events that they form a recognizable pattern. The animals were typically found dead with no external signs of struggle. There was no blood at the scene, which is deeply unusual for any kind of predator attack. Large predators leave blood, drag marks, disturbed soil. The wounds on the animals were described as surgically precise, organs removed cleanly, soft tissue excised with edges that, in some cases, appeared almost cauterized. Veterinary examination of some of the carcasses suggested that the cuts were not made with conventional blades, or at least not made in the way that a human with a conventional blade would make them. The precision was the thing that kept coming up. Not rough tearing, not the ragged damage you see from coyotes or mountain lions. Something that looked deliberate and controlled. No tracks were found near the carcasses, not human footprints, not animal prints, not vehicle tracks. Whatever was responsible for the deaths was not leaving the kind of physical evidence that would normally be unavoidable in soft soil. Some of the animals were found in areas that would have been difficult to access without leaving some kind of trace, which made the absence of tracks even harder to account for. Now, the skeptical explanation for cattle mutilations, and it is worth taking seriously, is that natural decomposition and insect activity can produce surprisingly clean-looking wounds. Blowflies and other insects tend to concentrate on soft tissue around the eyes, ears, mouth, and genitals first, which are also the areas most commonly described as missing in mutilation reports. The bloating and gas production of decomposition can force fluids back into the body cavity, which might account for the apparent absence of blood. This is a reasonable scientific argument, and it has been made by credentialed researchers. Some cases that were initially reported as mutilations have been re-examined and found to be consistent with natural scavenging and decomposition. But the NIDS researchers were not amateurs who had never seen a dead cow before. They included people with veterinary and biological training, and their assessment of the Skinwalker Ranch cases was that the natural decomposition explanation did not account for everything they observed. The speed at which some animals were found, in some cases within hours of their last confirmed sighting alive, made the full decomposition argument difficult to sustain. The precision of certain wounds under close examination did not look like insect activity. The absence of tracks remained unexplained by any natural process. The researchers did not claim to know what was responsible, but they did not accept the natural explanation as sufficient, and they documented their reasons for that position in detail. What they could not find is equally important to record honestly. Despite years of monitoring with sensitive instruments and a rotating team of observers, the NIDS investigation did not produce a clear photograph, video recording, or physical sample of any non-human entity or craft. There were camera malfunctions at moments that would have been significant, equipment that stopped working at inopportune times, which was itself noted as a pattern, though it is the kind of pattern that is impossible to evaluate objectively. There were accounts from researchers of lights and objects observed in person that were not captured on the monitoring equipment, which raised the question of whether the phenomena were somehow avoiding the cameras, or whether the cameras were simply not positioned correctly, or whether the accounts were mistaken. No definitive answer was reached. This is the honest scientific position on Skinwalker Ranch, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The instruments registered real anomalies. The anomalies were documented. The documentation does not resolve into a clean explanation. That is not a failure of the investigation, in any simple sense. It is a finding. It tells you that whatever is generating these readings and events is not something that responds to standard scientific methodology in a predictable way. That could mean many things. It could mean the phenomena are genuinely unusual in ways that current science is not equipped to handle. It could mean there are mundane explanations that the investigators missed. It could mean the phenomena are intermittent and rare enough that even years of monitoring produced only fragments. The data does not choose between these possibilities. It just sits there, documented and unexplained. The BASS period, running from 2008 through roughly 2012, extended the scientific monitoring with more resources and more personnel. Some of the researchers who worked under the BASS contract have spoken about their experiences on the property, though many are constrained by non-disclosure agreements that limit what they can say publicly. what has come out in interviews and in documents that have been partially released or discussed in congressional testimony paints a picture of a research environment that was both scientifically rigorous in its intentions and genuinely destabilizing in its outcomes. Several researchers reported physical effects after spending time on the property: headaches, disorientation, unusual fatigue. In a small number of cases, researchers described more acute symptoms: nausea, temporary vision disturbances, a feeling of cognitive confusion that lifted when they left the area. These kinds of reported physiological effects are difficult to evaluate because they are subjective, because the power of suggestion on the human body is real and significant, and because people who are primed to expect unusual experiences in an unusual environment are likely to interpret normal physical sensations through that lens. A headache is a headache. A headache on Skinwalker Ranch, after a night of watching for anomalies, can become something else in the mind of the person experiencing it. That said, the electromagnetic readings that were documented in certain areas of the property are the kind of readings that, in an industrial or occupational health context, would prompt concern about worker exposure. Elevated electromagnetic fields can cause exactly the kinds of symptoms that researchers reported: headaches, nausea, disorientation. If the electromagnetic anomalies on the ranch are real, and the instruments suggest they are, then the physiological effects may have a straightforward physical explanation that has nothing to do with any non-human agency. This is one of the areas where the scientific and the anomalous converge in a way that is genuinely hard to untangle. The symptoms might be caused by the electromagnetic environment. The electromagnetic environment might be caused by something unknown. One explanation does not preclude the other. The BAASS team also conducted more systematic analysis of the property's geology and subsurface structure than the earlier NIDS work had managed. The Uinta Basin has an interesting geological history. It is a sedimentary basin formed over millions of years, with layers of rock and soil that include some unusual mineral compositions. Some researchers have speculated that the geological properties of the basin might contribute to the electromagnetic anomalies, or might even be connected to the reported perceptual phenomena through mechanisms that are not fully understood. There is some scientific basis for the idea that certain geological environments can produce electromagnetic effects that influence human perception. The so-called tectonic stress hypothesis has been invoked to explain some historical accounts of unusual lights and experiences near fault lines and areas of geological stress. Whether this applies to the Uinta Basin is speculative, but it is not a fringe idea. It is a hypothesis with some grounding in geophysics, and the BAASS team was aware of it. What the geological analysis could not explain was the full range of documented anomalies. Geology might account for some of the electromagnetic readings. It does not obviously account for the cattle mutilations, the structured craft observed by multiple witnesses, the accounts of lights moving with apparent intelligence, or the poltergeist-like events reported inside the ranch house. These phenomena, if they are real, require something more than an unusual mineral composition in the local bedrock. The geological hypothesis is useful as a partial explanation. It does not come close to covering the whole picture. There is one more aspect of the scientific investigation that deserves attention, and it is the one that the researchers themselves seem to find most difficult to talk about without sounding like they have abandoned their scientific grounding entirely. Several of the people who worked on the property during both the NIDS and BAASS periods have described a sense that the phenomena were responsive, not just random, not just anomalous background noise. Responsive, as in appearing to react to the presence and activities of the investigators in ways that felt purposeful rather than coincidental. This was mentioned in the previous discussion of the AAWSAP program, but it is worth examining more concretely here, because it is a claim that has specific implications for how the scientific data should be interpreted. If the phenomena respond to observation, if they are in some sense aware of being studied, then the standard scientific approach of setting up instruments and waiting for repeatable events becomes fundamentally inadequate. You cannot run a controlled experiment on something that changes its behavior in response to the experimental setup. This is not a new problem in physics. Quantum mechanics introduced something structurally similar with the observer effect, though the scale and nature of what is being described at Skinwalker Ranch is very different. But the philosophical problem is real. How do you study something that studies you back? Colm Kelleher, who spent years on the property and brought a biochemist's training to the investigation, has spoken about this in interviews with a kind of careful reluctance, as if he is aware of how it sounds and is committed to saying it anyway, because it is what the data and the experience actually suggested to him. He has described specific instances where the phenomena seem to anticipate the placement of cameras, appearing in areas just outside the camera's field of view, or occurring moments before or after monitoring equipment was activated. Whether this is a real pattern or the product of selective memory and confirmation bias is genuinely impossible to determine from the outside. But Kelleher is not someone who reaches for dramatic conclusions easily. His scientific background makes him skeptical of his own perceptions, and he keeps coming back to the same observation. Whatever is at Skinwalker Ranch, it does not behave like a passive environmental phenomenon. It behaves like something that is aware. That is a claim without a comfortable home in any existing scientific framework. It is not something that the NIDS or BAASS research ever managed to prove or disprove. It is one of the threads that the investigation left dangling, significant enough to mention, unresolved enough to resist any clean conclusion. The data that was gathered over those years of instrumented monitoring is real. The anomalies are documented, the explanations are absent, and sitting beneath all of it is this uncomfortable suggestion that the investigation itself may have been, in some sense, a two-way encounter. By the time the BAAS program concluded and the formal scientific presence on the ranch wound down, the property had accumulated something remarkable. Decades of documented strangeness, layers of institutional attention, and a research record that was simultaneously more serious and less conclusive than almost anyone outside the investigation realized. The ranch had been monitored by PhD-level scientists, funded by a billionaire, contracted by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and none of it had produced a clean answer. What it had produced was a detailed and frustrating picture of a place that consistently generates anomalies that resist explanation, and a quiet but persistent question about what, exactly, is generating them. That question did not go away when the BAASS team packed up their instruments and left. It had a way of following people, apparently. And the property itself continued to sit in the winter basin, under that wide Utah sky, doing whatever it does when no one is watching. Or perhaps doing it whether anyone is watching or not. The next chapter of the rancher's story would bring a very different kind of attention, not classified, not quietly scientific, but very public, very televised, and reaching an audience that none of the previous investigators had ever imagined addressing. The man who would make that happen had been watching the ranch from a distance for some time before he finally decided to buy it. Brandon Fugal is not the kind of person you would expect to end up at the centre of a paranormal investigation. He is a commercial real estate developer based in Utah, one of the most successful in the region, and by most accounts a careful, methodical businessman who built his career on practical decisions and measurable outcomes. He is not, by temperament or profession, someone drawn to fringe ideas, which makes his decision to purchase Skinwalker Ranch in 2016, quietly, without public announcement, and at a price that has never been fully disclosed. One of the more genuinely interesting turns in the property's long history. Fugal had been aware of the ranch for some time before he bought it. He had read the Kelleher and Knapp book. He had followed the public reporting on the NIDS research. And he had, by his own account, a deep personal curiosity about what was actually happening on that property, not as a believer in any specific explanation, but as someone who found the accumulated evidence genuinely puzzling and thought it deserved more rigorous attention than it had received. He approached Bigelow about purchasing the ranch, and after some negotiation the sale went through. For the first few years, Fugal kept his ownership private. He began assembling a team and conducting his own preliminary investigations, largely out of public view. That changed in 2019, when the History Channel began airing a series called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, with Fugal appearing as the public owner and the investigation being conducted, at least in part, in front of cameras. The show's first season drew significant viewership, and subsequent seasons have continued to attract a large audience. As of the most recent seasons, the show is one of the more watched programs on the History Channel, which is not a small thing. Millions of people who had never heard of the Winter Basin or Robert Bigelow or AAWSAP found themselves watching footage of a Utah ranch where unexplained things kept happening to the people trying to study it. It is worth being honest about what the television format does to an investigation like this. Reality television has its own rhythms and incentives. Episodes need dramatic moments. Tension needs to be built and sustained. The editing process shapes what the viewer sees in ways that a scientific paper does not. All of that is real, and it is worth keeping in mind when evaluating what the show presents. The skeptical case against the show is not unreasonable. A production company has financial reasons to make things look more dramatic than they might be in unedited reality, and the presence of cameras on a property already saturated with expectation creates conditions that are not ideal for objective investigation. But here is the thing. Some of what the show documents is harder to dismiss than the typical reality television fare, and the reason for that is not atmosphere or editing, it is specificity. The show has, across its seasons, documented a number of incidents that involve multiple instruments, multiple witnesses, and in some cases physical consequences that are difficult to explain away as staged or imagined. One of the more striking recurring features of the show's documentation involves what the team calls triangulated sightings, UAP events that are tracked simultaneously by multiple cameras positioned at different points on the property. In one documented case, an object was observed moving across the sky above the ranch and captured on cameras from at least 3 different angles, allowing the team to establish rough trajectory and altitude. The object did not match the flight profile of known aircraft. It did not appear on the one occasion when the team had radar equipment active. It moved in a way that was inconsistent with balloons, drones, or conventional aircraft. Now the show presents this with a level of drama that is designed for television, and the analysis done on camera is not the same as peer-reviewed scientific analysis. But the raw footage from multiple cameras is real footage, and the object in it is genuinely unidentified. That is not nothing. There have also been documented incidents involving physical effects on team members. In one episode that drew particular attention from viewers, a team member spent an extended period near the mesa on the northeastern portion of the property, an area that will come up again shortly because it has become the focal point of the modern investigation, and began experiencing symptoms that included sudden headache, disorientation, and a sensation described as pressure behind the eyes. These symptoms appeared relatively quickly and resolved after the person left the area. The show's medical consultant reviewed the incident and was unable to identify a clear conventional cause. This kind of account is exactly the type that skeptics find easy to dismiss. Subjective symptoms reported by someone who is already primed to expect something unusual in a high-stress filming environment. That is a fair objection. But it is also consistent with accounts from the NIDS and BAASS periods, from people who were not on television and had no production incentive to report feeling unwell. The pattern of physical effects near specific areas of the property runs through the investigation's entire history. Equipment failures are another recurring feature of the show's documentation, and again, these are easy to be skeptical about in a television context. Cameras malfunctioning, batteries draining unexpectedly, electronic devices behaving erratically. All of these things can have mundane explanations, and all of them make for good television. but the team has documented specific instances of equipment failure that occurred in patterns consistent with the elevated electromagnetic readings that NIDS and BAASS researchers recorded in earlier decades. When a magnetometer reading spikes and a camera fails in the same location within a short window of time, that is at minimum an interesting correlation, even if it does not prove anything. Perhaps the most technically interesting category of findings from the modern investigation involves ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property, particularly around the mesa. The show has dedicated significant time to these surveys, and the results are, by any reasonable measure, unusual. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measuring the reflections that come back. Different materials reflect differently, and the pattern of reflections can be used to create a picture of what is underground. On the mesa and in surrounding areas, the radar surveys have suggested the presence of large cavities or void spaces at significant depth. The exact nature of these voids is not established. They could be natural geological formations. The Uinta Basin has complex subsurface geology, and cavities can form through various natural processes. But their size and location are unusual enough that the team has pursued drilling in an attempt to investigate further. The drilling attempts have produced their own strange results. In at least one documented case, a drill string encountered what appeared to be an extremely hard barrier at a certain depth, harder than the surrounding material, and in a position that the geological surveys had not predicted. The drill bit was damaged in the attempt to penetrate it. The team brought in geological consultants who were unable to immediately identify what the barrier was composed of. Drilling was halted. The nature of whatever stopped the drill has not been definitively determined. This is one of those details that sits uncomfortably in the middle of the investigation. Too specific and physical to be easily dismissed. Too ambiguous to be clearly explained. Fugal himself has been a consistent presence in the show's documentation, and his manner is one of the things that distinguishes the modern era of investigation from what a viewer might expect from paranormal television. He does not perform belief. He does not claim certainty about what is happening. He asks questions, pushes back on dramatic interpretations, and consistently frames the investigation in terms of data and methodology rather than spectacle. In interviews outside the show, he has described his own experience on the property in careful, measured terms, acknowledging that he has witnessed things he cannot explain, while resisting the temptation to assign those things to any specific cause. He has spoken about the investigation as a genuine scientific endeavour that happens to be taking place on camera, and while the television format inevitably shapes what the viewer sees, his personal credibility as a serious businessman with no obvious prior interest in paranormal celebrity is a relevant data point. The team he has assembled includes people with genuine technical credentials. Travis Taylor, who appears regularly on the show, holds a doctorate in optical science and engineering and has worked on projects for the Department of Defense. Eric Bard, the ranch's principal investigator, has a background in physics and engineering. The presence of people with real scientific training does not guarantee that the investigation is being conducted with full scientific rigour. Television constraints are real, but it does mean that the conversations happening on camera about instrument readings and anomalous data are not entirely uninformed. These are people who understand what they are looking at least in terms of the instruments themselves. What the show has also done, perhaps more than any previous chapter of the ranch's history, is create a public record. The NIDS research was largely internal. The BAAS's work was classified. The Kelleher and Knapp book was widely read, but was still a book. The television series puts footage, actual footage from multiple cameras in real time, in front of millions of viewers. That is a different kind of documentation than anything the ranch has had before. It is imperfect documentation, shaped by production decisions and editing choices. But it exists, and it is accumulating across seasons in a way that makes the ranch's history more publicly traceable than it has ever been. There is a tension at the heart of the modern era that is worth naming directly. The show is a commercial product made by a production company for a cable network. The ranch is also, genuinely, a place where unusual things have been documented across decades by multiple independent investigators with no connection to television. These two things coexist, and the challenge for anyone trying to evaluate the modern investigation is to hold both of them at once, to take the television format's limitations seriously without using those limitations as a reason to dismiss everything the cameras have captured. That is a harder analytical position to hold than either full belief or full dismissal, but it is probably the honest one. What Fugel's ownership has added to the ranch's story is a kind of continuity and visibility that the previous eras lacked. Bigelow's investigation was serious but hidden. The Sherman family's experience was personal and largely private until Kelleher and Knapp wrote about it. The government contract was classified for years. Fugel has put the ranch in front of the largest audience it has ever had, and he has done it while maintaining, at least publicly, a commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads, rather than committing to a predetermined explanation. The investigation under his ownership has also expanded in scope. The ground-penetrating radar surveys are more extensive than anything the NIDS team attempted. The aerial monitoring has been upgraded. The team has brought in specialists in fields ranging from geology to aerospace engineering to medicine. Whether all of this produces a definitive answer remains to be seen. The ranch has a long history of resisting definitive answers, but the modern era is generating more data, more publicly, than any previous phase of the investigation. One thing that the show has made clear, even to skeptical viewers, is that the property continues to generate anomalous events. Not every episode, not on demand, not in ways that are always captured cleanly by instruments, but with enough regularity and in enough specific locations on the property that the pattern is difficult to attribute entirely to expectation and suggestion. The mesa, in particular, keeps producing readings and experiences that the team cannot explain. Whatever is happening there, and that question is coming up soon, because it deserves its own careful attention, it does not appear to be settling down. If anything, the modern investigation has suggested that the anomalous activity at the ranch is more physically concentrated and more instrumentally detectable than the earlier research fully appreciated. The public era of Skinwalker Ranch has changed what the investigation looks like from the outside. It has brought in viewers, commentators, believers, skeptics, and everything in between. It has made the ranch one of the most talked about locations in the ongoing conversation about UAP and unexplained phenomena, and it has kept the cameras rolling on a piece of land in northeastern Utah that has been generating questions since long before anyone pointed a camera at it. But cameras and viewers and television seasons are in a sense the surface of what is happening here. Underneath all of it, underneath the production schedules and the dramatic episode endings and the millions of people watching from their couches, there is still the actual physical property, the actual ground, the actual mesa sitting in the northeastern corner of the ranch, with its elevated electromagnetic readings and its strange radar signatures and its history of making people feel unwell. The television show brought the ranch to the world, but the mesa has been doing whatever it does long before the first camera crew arrived. And it is to the mesa that the investigation keeps returning, because whatever explanation eventually emerges for what is happening at Skinwalker Ranch, it is very likely to start there. The mesa sits in the northeastern corner of the ranch, like something that has been waiting. That is probably too dramatic a way to put it, but it is hard to describe the mesa without reaching for language that feels slightly larger than usual, because the data that has come out of that particular piece of ground is consistently unlike anything else on the property. And the property itself is already unusual. The mesa is unusual within the unusual, which makes it the natural centre of gravity for anyone trying to understand what is actually happening here. Physically, it is not a dramatic landform. It rises maybe 30 feet or so above the surrounding valley floor. A flat-topped, roughly rectangular elevation on the northeastern edge of the 512 acres. In the wide open landscape of the Winter Basin, it would not catch your eye as particularly significant. There are mesas all over Utah. The geology of the Colorado Plateau and the surrounding basin regions produces them naturally, and most of them are exactly what they look like. Ancient rock, erosion, time. This one, from a distance, looks the same as any other. Up close, though, something changes. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself. Team members who have spent extended time on or near the mesa have described a kind of low-level discomfort that builds gradually. Headaches are the most commonly reported symptom. Disorientation is another. Nausea has come up in multiple accounts from different people across different seasons of investigation. These are not exotic symptoms. They are the kind of thing that could have a dozen ordinary explanations. Heat, dehydration, the psychological pressure of expecting something unusual in a place famous for unusual things. The investigators on site have considered all of those possibilities. The reason the symptoms keep drawing attention is not that they are dramatic, but that they are consistent, and that they correlate with locations on the mesa where instruments also register elevated readings. That correlation is the part that is harder to dismiss. If people were simply feeling unwell while standing on the mesa, and the instruments were reading normal, you would weight the psychological explanation heavily. But the instruments are not reading normal. Electromagnetic readings on and near the mesa are consistently elevated compared to baseline measurements taken elsewhere on the property. Magnetometer readings fluctuate in ways that do not track with any obvious natural source, and ground-penetrating radar surveys of the mesa and the ground beneath it have returned signatures that the geologists and engineers who have reviewed the data find genuinely difficult to explain. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending radio waves into the ground and measuring how they bounce back. Different materials, rock, soil, water, air, reflect the signal differently, and a trained interpreter can read the return data to build a rough picture of what is underground. It is not a perfect technology, it has limitations, and interpreting its output requires expertise and careful methodology. The surveys conducted at the mesa during the modern era of investigation have suggested the presence of large cavities or void spaces beneath the surface, not small gaps in the rock. Large spaces, the kind that would be significant if confirmed by additional methods. Some of the radar signatures have been described by the investigators reviewing them as consistent with tunnel structures, though that interpretation carries uncertainty and has not been independently verified to a standard that would satisfy a peer-reviewed publication. What makes the radar data interesting is not any single reading but the pattern across multiple surveys. The anomalous signatures appear consistently in the same areas beneath the mesa. They do not shift around or disappear between surveys. Whatever is producing those signatures is stable and localized. That suggests something physical, not a sensor artifact or a calibration error. The drilling attempts have added another layer to the mesa story. In at least one documented and filmed attempt to drill into the mesa, to collect core samples and get a better physical sense of what is underground, the drill encountered resistance at a certain depth that the team could not immediately account for. The drill string was damaged. The bit was stopped by what appeared to be an extremely hard barrier, harder than the surrounding material had suggested it would be. This could have a geological explanation. There are materials, certain types of dense rock, certain mineral formations, that could produce that kind of resistance. But the location of the barrier, corresponding roughly with the areas flagged by the radar surveys as anomalous, made the coincidence notable enough that the investigators treated it as a data point rather than a simple equipment problem. It is worth being clear about what this does and does not mean. A hard barrier underground does not imply anything exotic. Hard rock exists. Mining and drilling operations hit unexpected resistance all the time. The reason this particular incident matters is not that it is impossible to explain geologically, but that it adds a third consistent element to the mesa's profile: anomalous radar signatures, elevated electromagnetic readings, and now a physical drilling anomaly in the same general area. 3 independent types of data pointing to the same location is more interesting than any one of them alone. The NIDS research from the Bigelow era also flagged the mesa, though the earlier investigation did not have the same quality of ground-penetrating radar equipment that the modern team uses. The older reports noted elevated readings in the northeastern portion of the property, the mesa's location, and described it as one of the areas where anomalous events seemed to cluster. The Sherman family, in their accounts from the mid-1990s, described seeing lights near the mesa more frequently than in other parts of the property. Gwen Sherman, in particular, mentioned the mesa area when describing where the sense of being watched felt strongest. These are subjective accounts, and they carry the usual limitations of witness testimony. But they are consistent with what the instruments have registered across multiple eras of investigation, which is at minimum an interesting pattern. One of the stranger claims associated with the mesa involves what some team members have described as a feeling of being monitored, not just watched in the ordinary human sense, but observed in a more active, responsive way. Some of the investigators have noted that anomalous events seem to increase when they approach the mesa with equipment, as if whatever is generating the phenomena is reacting to the attention. This is a deeply unusual claim, and it is one that sits uncomfortably in any conventional scientific framework, because science generally assumes that the thing being studied does not know it is being studied. The idea that a phenomenon might be interactive, that it might respond to observation, is something that some parapsychology researchers have proposed as a feature of certain types of anomalous events. But it is far from established, and it is the kind of claim that requires extraordinary evidence before it should be taken seriously. What can be said more conservatively is that the timing of events on and near the mesa has sometimes been unusual. Equipment that functions normally elsewhere on the property has malfunctioned near the mesa. Team members who approach the mesa without specific intent to investigate have sometimes reported symptoms that appear before they have any reason to expect them. These are anecdotal observations, and they are the kind of thing that confirmation bias can produce even in careful observers. But they keep appearing in the accounts of people who have spent real time on the property, across years and across different teams, and that consistency is at least worth noting. There have also been specific physical events near the mesa that are harder to categorize. In one instance documented during the television series, a team member experienced a sudden onset of physical symptoms, including what was described as a measurable change in neurological function, while working in close proximity to the mesa. The symptoms were significant enough that the team treated them as a medical concern, and the individual was evaluated. The cause was not determined. Whether this was a coincidence, a stress response, an environmental exposure, or something related to whatever is generating the anomalous readings on the mesa is not known. It is one of those data points that sits in the unresolved column and stays there. The physical effects on team members are actually one of the more interesting categories of evidence from the mesa, precisely because they are not purely subjective. Headaches and nausea can be reported without corroboration. But when a team member shows measurable physiological changes that can be documented by a medical professional, that becomes a different kind of data point. It is still not conclusive. There are many things that can produce physiological effects, including anxiety, environmental factors, and electromagnetic exposure. But elevated electromagnetic fields have known biological effects on humans, and the mesa is a location where electromagnetic readings are consistently elevated. The connection between the instrumented anomalies and the human physiological responses is at least a coherent hypothesis that could, in principle, be tested more rigorously than it has been so far. What the mesa does not do is provide easy answers. Every line of investigation into it opens onto more questions. The radar signatures suggest voids, but voids of what? Formed how and when? The electromagnetic readings are elevated, but elevated compared to what baseline and what is generating the field? The drilling resistance suggests a hard barrier, but what kind of rock, and does it connect to anything the radar has detected? The physiological effects on team members are real, but are they caused by the electromagnetic environment, by something else in the physical environment, or by factors unrelated to whatever is underground? None of these questions have been answered to a standard that would satisfy a rigorous scientific review. That is the honest position, and it is worth holding on to as the investigation continues. The Mesa is the most instrumentally anomalous location on a property that has been generating anomalous data for 30 years. It is the focal point of the current investigation for good reason, because the data keeps pointing there, and the data is coming from instruments, not just from people's feelings. But instruments can be misread, surveys can be misinterpreted, and correlations can be coincidental. The Mesa deserves serious investigation, and it is getting it. What it has not yet produced is a definitive explanation. There is something that feels almost geological about the patience required to investigate a place like this. Rock takes millions of years to form, and it does not hurry for anyone. The Mesa has been sitting in the northeastern corner of this property for a very long time, longer than the ranch, longer than the Ute people's presence in the basin, longer than any human memory of the land. Whatever is inside it, or beneath it, or associated with it, has been there through all of the investigation and all of the cameras and all of the theories. It is not going anywhere. The investigators are the ones who have to keep coming back season after season with better instruments and more careful methodology, hoping that the next survey, or the next drill attempt, or the next set of readings will finally resolve into something they can name. The Mesa also has a quality that the rest of the ranch's history shares. It resists the clean narrative. It does not fit neatly into the geological explanation, because the geological explanation does not account for the electromagnetic anomalies. It does not fit neatly into the UAP explanation, because UAP typically involve aerial phenomena, not underground signatures. It does not fit neatly into the psychic or consciousness-related explanations, because the instrumented data is independent of any individual's perception. It sits across multiple explanatory frameworks at once, which is part of why it is so difficult to evaluate, and part of why it keeps drawing serious investigators back. Some researchers who have reviewed the available data on the Mesa have suggested that the underground void signatures, if confirmed by independent survey, could point toward a natural tunnel system, karst formations, lava tubes, or other geological structures that are not uncommon in the American West. These structures can produce unusual electromagnetic signatures, particularly if they contain water or certain mineral deposits. They can also produce the kind of hard barriers that stop the drill. This is a genuinely plausible geological hypothesis, and it would be significant in its own right. A large underground void system beneath a ranch in northeastern Utah would be an interesting geological finding regardless of any paranormal context. But the geological explanation, even if confirmed, would not account for all of the Mesa's documented anomalies. It would not explain the physiological effects on team members, which are more consistent with an active electromagnetic source than with a passive geological void. It would not explain the events that have been documented above ground near the Mesa, the lights, the instrument malfunctions, the tracking anomalies. The Mesa is not a single mystery. It is several overlapping ones sharing a location, and the location itself may be the most important clue. The fact that all of these different types of anomaly converge on the same 30-foot high piece of ground in the northeastern corner of a 512-acre ranch in the Utah Basin. Convergence of that kind is either a very elaborate coincidence or an indication that something about this specific location is genuinely unusual in ways that current investigation has not yet fully characterized. What the modern investigation has done, whatever its limitations, is make the Mesa a more specific and better documented focus than it has ever been before. The NIDS team knew it was anomalous. The Sherman family knew it felt wrong. The Ute people, in their oral traditions about this land, did not distinguish the Mesa specifically, but they regarded the whole area as a place of concentrated strangeness. The modern investigation, with better instruments and more sustained attention, has narrowed that strangeness down to a specific piece of ground with specific measurable properties. That is progress, even if it is not resolution. the investigation is not finished with the Mesa. The ground-penetrating radar surveys are ongoing. There are plans for additional drilling attempts, with equipment better suited to whatever stopped the last drill. The electromagnetic monitoring continues. The physiological data from team members is being tracked and compared across visits. The Mesa is not a closed chapter in the ranch's story. It is, if anything, the chapter that the investigation is most actively writing right now. And whatever that chapter eventually contains, geological explanation, something stranger, or a combination of both that does not fit any existing category, it will be built on a foundation of data that is more extensive and more carefully gathered than anything the ranch has produced before. The Mesa keeps its own counsel, the way old ground tends to do. It does not answer questions on a schedule. But the questions being asked of it now are more precise, and the tools being used to ask them are more capable than at any previous point in the ranch's long and unusual history. Whether that precision and capability are finally enough to produce something definitive is one of the open questions that carries the investigation forward, and it is a question that the skeptics, for all their reasonable objections, have not yet been able to close off entirely. Because the data from the Mesa is real, it is documented, and it does not yet have a satisfying explanation. That is the ground the investigation is standing on, and it is the same ground, in both senses of the word, that the next serious question has to start from. And yet, for all of that, the data, the instruments, the government contracts, the decades of accumulated accounts, there is another voice in this conversation, a quieter one in some ways, a more methodical one, and it deserves to be heard clearly, not dismissed, not caricatured, not reduced to the role of the killjoy who refuses to wonder. The skeptical case against Skinwalker Ranch is not a thin argument. In several important respects, it is a very good one. Start with the most basic problem, peer-reviewed published data. In 30 years of investigation, from the Sherman family's accounts in 1994, through the NIDS years, through the BAASS program, through the current television-era research, almost none of the findings have appeared in peer-reviewed scientific literature. This is not a minor procedural complaint. Peer review is the mechanism by which scientific claims are tested by independent researchers who have no stake in the outcome. It is slow, sometimes frustrating, often imperfect, but it is the closest thing science has to a reliable filter for separating genuine anomalies from measurement error, confirmation bias, and wishful thinking. The NIDS team included PhD-level scientists. The BAASS program had a $22 million federal contract. If the data gathered at this ranch over 3 decades were as compelling as its proponents suggest, there would be a reasonable expectation of at least some peer-reviewed publications. There are essentially none. Colm Kelleher and George Knapp's book is carefully written and genuinely interesting, but it is not a peer-reviewed scientific document. It is a journalist and a scientist writing for a general audience, and the standards of evidence it applies are different from those required by a scientific journal. That gap matters. Joe Nickell, a longtime investigator for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, has written about Skinwalker Ranch on more than one occasion. His position is roughly this. The ranch is a location that has been invested with enormous cultural and financial significance, and once that investment exists, the people who go there are primed to find what they are looking for. This is not an accusation of dishonesty. It is a description of how human perception works. We are pattern-seeking animals, and when we enter a space where we have been told that strange things happen, we interpret ambiguous sensory data through that frame. A sound that would be unremarkable in another context becomes evidence of something unusual. A light on the horizon becomes a UAP. Equipment that malfunctions, as equipment often does, especially in remote locations with variable power supplies, becomes confirmation of an electromagnetic anomaly. Nichols' argument is that the ranch has become a self-reinforcing belief system. The expectation of strangeness generates the experience of strangeness, which reinforces the expectation, which draws more investigators who arrive already expecting to find something, round and round. This is a genuinely important point. The psychology of anomalous experience is well documented. Studies of people who visit allegedly haunted locations have found that individuals who are told a location is haunted report significantly more unusual experiences than those who are not told anything, even when the location is identical. Suggestion is powerful. Expectation shapes perception in ways that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. If you spend a night on a property that you have been told is the most anomalous place in America, your nervous system is going to be running at a heightened state of alert. You will notice things you would otherwise filter out. You will interpret them through the available narrative. That is not weakness or gullibility. It is just how human brains work. And it is a factor that any serious investigation of Skinwalker Ranch has to account for. The cattle mutilation evidence, which has been one of the more viscerally striking elements of the ranch's story since the Sherman years, has a well-developed skeptical explanation. In the 1970s and 1980s, when cattle mutilations were being reported across the American West in large numbers, the FBI conducted an investigation. Their conclusion, published in 1980, was that the vast majority of cases could be explained by natural predation and post-mortem decomposition. Certain insects, blowflies in particular, feed on soft tissue in ways that can produce surprisingly clean, almost surgical-looking wounds. Scavengers tend to feed on the softest parts of an animal first: the eyes, the lips, the tongue, the genitals, the anus. These are exactly the areas most commonly described as being surgically removed in mutilation reports. The absence of blood can be explained by natural drainage and coagulation after death. The absence of predator tracks can be explained by hard ground, wind, or the simple fact that investigators often arrive days after the animal was found. None of this is comfortable or pleasant to think about, but it is a coherent and evidence-supported explanation that does not require anything unusual. This does not mean every cattle death at Skinwalker Ranch is fully explained by natural processes. It means the bar for claiming that the deaths are anomalous is higher than it might initially appear, because the alternative explanation is better than most people realize. Then there is the television question, which is harder to set aside than some of the show's supporters would like. The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch is produced by a television production company for a cable network. It has millions of viewers and has run for multiple seasons. It is, by any reasonable commercial measure, a successful entertainment product, and that success creates incentives that are not necessarily aligned with rigorous scientific investigation. Television requires narrative momentum. It requires episodes that end with something interesting happening. It requires personalities who react visibly to events. It requires a structure that keeps viewers coming back next week. None of these requirements are compatible with the actual pace of scientific investigation, which involves long periods of nothing, careful data collection, and conclusions that are often provisional and unexciting. When you watch the show, you're watching a version of the ranch that has been edited, structured, and presented to maximize engagement. That is not a conspiracy. It is just television. But it is worth being clear-eyed about what that means for evaluating the evidence the show presents. Some of the show's most dramatic moments, team members experiencing sudden physical symptoms, equipment failing at key moments, objects appearing on camera, are difficult to evaluate because the production context makes it impossible to rule out staging, editing, or the kind of selective presentation that makes ordinary events look extraordinary. This is not an accusation against any specific person. It is a structural problem with using a television show as a primary source of scientific evidence. There is also a financial dimension to the modern era of the ranch that is worth naming plainly. Brandon Fugel purchased the property in 2016. The television show that followed has made the ranch significantly more famous than it was during the NIDS years. Fugel has been open about his belief that the ranch is genuinely anomalous, and he appears to be a sincere person who takes the investigation seriously. But he is also a real estate developer and businessman who owns a property whose value has been substantially enhanced by its association with the television show and the ongoing public interest in its mysteries. The ranch's fame is, at this point, an asset. That does not mean the investigation is fraudulent. It means that the financial and reputational incentives around the property are no longer neutral, and that is a factor a careful evaluator has to keep in mind. And there is one more skeptical point that is less commonly made but worth considering. The history of paranormal investigation is full of locations that attracted intense, sustained, serious-seeming investigation and eventually produced nothing definitive. The Enfield Poltergeist, Borley Rectory, the Amityville House. Each of these became the subject of books, investigations, television programs, and genuine public fascination. Each of them attracted researchers who believed they were on the verge of something significant. None of them produced evidence that withstood independent scientific scrutiny. Skinwalker Ranch has lasted longer than most, attracted more serious institutional attention than most, and generated more varied types of anomalous report than most. But the pattern, sustained investigation, dramatic claims, no peer-reviewed confirmation, is one that the history of anomalous research has seen before. All of that is the honest skeptical case, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not nothing. But here is where the skeptical case runs into its own difficulties, and where the ranch becomes genuinely interesting, even to a careful, critical observer. The $22 million government contract is not easily explained by any of the psychological or perceptual arguments. The Defense Intelligence Agency does not fund programs because of expectation bias or the power of suggestion. The AAW SAP program was a serious federal initiative, reviewed and approved through the standard mechanisms of defense appropriations, with Senator Harry Reid of Nevada as one of its key advocates. Reid was a pragmatic, experienced politician, not someone with a reputation for credulous enthusiasm about the paranormal. The program ran for several years and produced internal reports that, to the extent they have been declassified or described by participants, suggest that the government investigators took the ranch seriously as a research site. You can argue about what they found there. You cannot easily argue that the whole thing was a product of suggestion and expectation, because the people who approved and oversaw the program were not on site, were not primed by the ranch's atmosphere, and had institutional reasons to be skeptical of anything that would waste federal money. The instrumented data is also a genuine complication for the purely psychological explanation. When a magnetometer registers an anomalous reading, it is not experiencing expectation bias. When a radiation detector spikes in a specific location on a property, it is measuring something physical. The skeptical response to this is that instruments can malfunction, that readings can be misinterpreted, and that without peer-reviewed analysis of the raw data, it is difficult to assess what the readings actually mean. All of that is true, but it is a different kind of objection than the psychological one. It is an argument about the quality of the data, not about whether data exists at all. And the argument about data quality is harder to make definitively when the instruments were operated by PhD-level scientists over multiple years. The consistency of accounts across very different types of observers is also something the skeptical framework struggles with. The Sherman family were working ranchers with no prior interest in the paranormal. The NIDS team were scientists with professional reputations to protect. The BAASS investigators included people with military and intelligence backgrounds. The Ute people's oral traditions about this land predate all of them by generations. None of these groups had obvious reasons to coordinate their accounts, and all of them described a broadly similar pattern: unusual lights, unusual animal deaths, unusual physical effects in specific areas of the property. The skeptical explanation for this consistency is that the accounts are not independent, that later observers were influenced by earlier reports, that the cultural frame of the ranch shapes what people report experiencing. This is plausible, it is also not proven, and the Ute traditions, which predate modern investigation by a very long time, are harder to fold into that explanation than the accounts of people who arrived after reading the Kelleher and Knapp book. What the skeptical case establishes, at its strongest, is this. The evidence for anything truly extraordinary at Skinwalker Ranch has not been confirmed to a scientific standard. That is a real and important conclusion. It means that anyone who tells you the ranch has proven the existence of alien craft or portals or non-human intelligence is overstating what the evidence shows. The evidence does not show that. Not yet, and possibly not ever. What the skeptical case does not establish is that nothing unusual is happening there. The absence of peer-reviewed confirmation is not the same as proof of absence. The financial incentives around the television show are a legitimate reason for caution, but they do not retroactively explain the NIDS data or the government contract. The psychological power of suggestion is real, but it does not account for instrument readings. The cattle mutilation alternative explanation is good, but it is an explanation for a general pattern, not a confirmed explanation for every specific case at this specific ranch. The most honest position, sitting between the believers and the dismissers, is probably something like this. There is enough documented anomalous data from enough different sources over enough time that the ranch warrants serious, rigorous independent investigation, not television production, not self-funded research by the property owner, genuinely independent peer-reviewed scientific investigation with full access to the raw data and no financial stake in any particular outcome. Whether that investigation would find something extraordinary or find a collection of explainable anomalies that had been collectively misread for 30 years, that is a genuinely open question. And the skeptics, for all the strength of their arguments, have not yet produced a comprehensive alternative explanation that accounts for everything the ranch has generated. They have accounted for parts of it. The whole remains stubbornly unresolved. That unresolved quality is frustrating if you want a clean answer. It is interesting if you're willing to sit with complexity. The ranch has a way of resisting the neat verdict from both directions. The believers cannot point to confirmed, independently verified proof of anything extraordinary. The skeptics cannot point to a confirmed, comprehensive explanation for 30 years of instrumented anomalies, government interest, and consistent cross-observer accounts. Both sides are left with the same messy, inconclusive picture. They just interpret the mess differently. Which brings us in a way to the most interesting question the ranch raises. Not what is happening there, but what explanations are even being seriously considered by the people who have looked at it most carefully. Because the hypotheses that serious investigators have proposed are not all the same, and they do not all agree with each other, and some of them are stranger than others, and a few of them are stranger than almost anything the believers on the television show have suggested. So let us actually look at those hypotheses, not the ones that get floated casually in comment sections or late-night forums, but the ones that researchers with relevant credentials have proposed after spending real time with the data, because they are more varied and in some ways more surprising than the popular narrative around the ranch tends to suggest. The first, and in many ways the most grounded hypothesis, is geological. The Uinta Basin sits atop a complex subsurface geology. There are natural gas deposits, fault lines, unusual mineral concentrations, and a history of seismic activity that is modest by global standards but present. Some researchers have proposed that the ranch sits in an area with unusually high or variable electromagnetic fields generated by the geology itself, and that these fields could account for a significant portion of what gets reported there. This is not a fringe idea. There is a well-established body of research associated most prominently with the neuroscientist Michael Persinger, suggesting that strong or rapidly fluctuating electromagnetic fields can produce perceptual effects in human beings, visual anomalies, feelings of presence, disorientation, even what some people describe as encounters with entities. Persinger's work is contested, and his specific claims about the mechanisms involved have not been universally accepted, but the general principle that electromagnetic environments can affect human perception is not controversial in neuroscience. Applied to Skinwalker Ranch, this hypothesis would suggest that some portion of the reported experiences, the feelings of being watched, the strange lights seen at the periphery of vision, the sense of something moving in the dark, could be the result of the human nervous system responding to an unusual physical environment, rather than to any external intelligence. This hypothesis has real explanatory power for the experiential reports. It is less helpful for the cattle mutilation data, and it does not obviously account for structured craft tracked on multiple instruments simultaneously. But it is worth taking seriously as a partial explanation, and the fact that ground-penetrating radar has suggested unusual subsurface features beneath the mesa is at least consistent with the idea that there is something physically unusual about the geology of the property. The elevated electromagnetic readings in specific areas, the radiation spikes that have been documented in certain parts of the ranch, these could reflect natural geophysical processes that are simply more concentrated or more variable at this location than in the surrounding basin. The honest answer is that no one has done the kind of comprehensive geological survey that would confirm or rule this out. The property has been studied intensively for paranormal phenomena. It has not been studied with the same intensity as a straightforward geological question, which is itself a little strange when you think about it. The second hypothesis is the one most associated with the ranch in popular culture, and it is the one that the television show leans into most heavily, that Skinwalker Ranch is a genuine UAP hotspot. That is, a location where unidentified aerial phenomena, whatever their ultimate nature, appear with unusual frequency and can be documented with instruments. This hypothesis does not require a claim about the origin or nature of the phenomena. It simply proposes that whatever UAP are, they seem to concentrate at certain locations, and this ranch is one of them. The evidence that gets cited in support of this includes the triangulated camera footage from the television show, the NIDS reports of structured objects with coloured lights, the Sherman family's accounts of craft hovering over the property, and the broader regional history of UAP sightings in the Winter Basin going back decades before the Shermans ever arrived. What makes this hypothesis interesting is that it is, in principle, testable. If UAP appear at this location with unusual frequency, a sufficiently well-equipped, long-duration monitoring effort should be able to document that. The challenge is that the monitoring efforts that have been conducted under NIDS, under BAASS, and under the current ownership, have produced data that is suggestive but not conclusive. Suggestive because multiple instruments have registered anomalies simultaneously, and because some of the documented events do not have obvious conventional explanations. Not conclusive because the data has not been published in a form that allows independent scientific review. This is the core frustration for anyone trying to evaluate the UAP hypothesis seriously. The people who have had the most access to the property have not made their full data sets available to the broader scientific community, whether that is because the data is genuinely sensitive, because the findings are embarrassing in one direction or another, or simply because the owners have preferred to control the narrative. It is hard to say. The result is that the UAP hypothesis remains plausible but unconfirmed, which is exactly where it has been for 30 years. The third hypothesis is the one that tends to make scientifically trained people most uncomfortable, and that is the parapsychological explanation. Some researchers who have worked at the ranch, and this includes people with genuine scientific credentials, not just enthusiasts, have proposed that the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch are not purely physical in the conventional sense, but are in some way connected to consciousness or to mental states. This does not mean they think the events are imaginary. It means they think the relationship between observation and phenomenon at this location is different from what conventional physics would predict. There is a specific, recurring claim made by several investigators that the phenomena at the ranch appear to be interactive, that they seem to respond to being watched, that they change behaviour when instruments are pointed at them, that they are somehow aware of the attention being directed at them. If this is true, it is an extraordinarily strange claim. It would suggest that whatever is generating the anomalies at the ranch is not a passive geological or atmospheric process, but something with a capacity for something like awareness or response. This idea has roots in parapsychology research that goes back to the mid-20th century, and it connects to broader debates about the nature of consciousness that are ongoing in philosophy and physics. It is not mainstream science, but it is not pure fantasy either. The physicist Hal Puthoff, who's been involved in government-funded research into unconventional phenomena since the 1970s, and who has connections to the Skinwalker Ranch investigations, has written about the possibility that some anomalous phenomena may require frameworks beyond current physics to explain. Puthoff is a serious scientist with a legitimate publication record. His views on these matters are not universally shared, but they are not the views of a crank. The parapsychological hypothesis is the hardest to evaluate precisely because it does not fit neatly into any existing scientific framework. If the phenomena respond to observation, how do you design a study to test that without the act of designing the study becoming part of the phenomenon? It is a genuinely difficult methodological problem, and it is one that the ranch seems to present in a particularly acute form. The fourth hypothesis is more straightforwardly physical, and it concerns what might be underground. The ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted on the property, particularly around the mesa, have suggested the presence of large cavities or tunnels beneath the surface. The drilling attempts that encountered unexpected resistance at specific depths are consistent with the idea that there is something physically unusual below the ground. One explanation is purely geological, natural cave systems or unusual rock formations. The Uinta Basin does have karst-like features in some areas, and natural cavities in sedimentary rock are not unusual in the American West. But some investigators have proposed a more provocative version of this hypothesis, that the underground anomalies reflect the presence of an installation of some kind, either human or otherwise. The human version of this would involve some kind of classified military or intelligence facility using the property or the land beneath it in ways that are not publicly disclosed. This would explain some of the electromagnetic anomalies, some of the equipment malfunctions, and potentially some of the structured aerial phenomena if they involve classified aircraft operating in the area. The non-human version of this hypothesis is obviously more speculative, and it connects to the broader UAP literature about underground or underwater facilities. It is worth noting that the Uinta Basin is not far from Hill Air Force Base and various other military installations in Utah, and that the region has a history of classified military activity. This does not prove anything. It is a geographical fact that is worth holding alongside the other data. What is striking when you lay these four hypotheses side by side is that they do not all compete with each other in the way that explanations usually do. It is possible, for instance, that the geological hypothesis is correct for some of what gets reported at the ranch, while the UAP hypothesis is correct for another portion, and the underground anomalies are a separate physical reality that has its own explanation. Real places are complicated. They do not always have a single explanation. The Uinta Basin is a large, geologically complex, historically layered region, and the ranch sits at a particular point within it that may concentrate multiple independent factors in ways that produce an unusually dense accumulation of strange events. This is not a satisfying conclusion in the way that a single unified theory would be, but it may be more accurate. There is one more thing worth spending some time on, and it is the claim about interactivity, because it keeps coming up across very different investigators and very different eras of research. The NIDS scientists noted it. The BASS investigators mentioned it. People associated with the current television production have described it. The specific form the claim takes varies, but the core of it is consistent. The phenomena at the ranch seem to be aware that they are being studied. Events appear to happen just outside the range of cameras. Equipment seems to malfunction at key moments. Whatever is producing the anomalies appears to avoid direct, unambiguous documentation. This could be interpreted in several ways. The skeptical interpretation is that this is exactly what you would expect from a combination of random events and human pattern recognition. People notice when something interesting happens near a camera more than when nothing happens, and they interpret the camera's absence as deliberate avoidance. This is a reasonable point. Human beings are extraordinarily good at finding patterns, including patterns that are not there. But the researchers who have been on site for extended periods describe the interactivity in terms that are harder to reduce to pattern recognition alone. They describe a quality to the events that feels responsive in real time, not just that cameras miss things, but that the events seem to calibrate themselves to the limits of what is being measured. When the instrumentation improves, the events do not simply become clearer. They seem to shift in ways that stay just beyond the edge of what the new instruments can confirm. This is a strange thing to claim, and it is difficult to know how seriously to take it. But it is being claimed by people who are not obviously credulous, and it has been claimed consistently enough across enough different investigators that it is at least worth noting as a recurring feature of the testimony. If it is true, and that is a very large if, it would suggest that the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch are not just unusual, but are in some sense agentive, that they have something like intention. That is a claim that goes well beyond any of the four hypotheses described above, and it is one that current science does not have a framework for evaluating. What you're left with, when you try to honestly assess all of this, is a layered problem. At the base layer there is a place with unusual physical properties, geological, electromagnetic, possibly subsurface, that may account for some portion of the reported anomalies. Above that, there is a long history of UAP sightings in the region that predates modern investigation and that has been documented by multiple independent observers. Above that, there is a body of instrumented data from serious researchers that suggests something physical and real is happening at specific locations on the property, even if the nature of that something remains unclear. And above all of that, there are the experiential accounts from the Shermans, from the NIDS team, from the BAASS investigators, from the current research staff, that describe events which none of the available physical hypotheses fully explain. No single framework covers all of it. The geological hypothesis covers some. The UAP hypothesis covers some. The parapsychological hypothesis reaches for the parts that the others cannot touch. The underground anomaly hypothesis is a physical question that has not been answered, and the interactivity claim, if it holds up, suggests that whatever is happening at the ranch may not be the kind of phenomenon that any of our current investigative frameworks are actually designed to study. This is where the ranch sits right now. Not at a point of resolution, but at a point where the honest investigators, the ones who are neither true believers nor reflexive dismissers, are sitting with a genuinely difficult set of questions and trying to figure out what kind of tools and methods might actually be adequate to the problem. That is not a dramatic place to be. It does not make for a clean television ending. But it is the real intellectual situation, and it is more interesting in its way than a confirmed answer would be. Because a confirmed answer would close the question. What the ranch presents instead is a question that keeps opening further the more carefully you look at it. And what happens when you keep looking, what the physical landscape itself keeps suggesting, and what the ongoing investigation continues to find, is where the story moves next. So let us go back to the land itself for a moment. Because the land is always there, underneath all of it. The theories, the television cameras, the government contracts, the arguments about what is real and what is not. The interbasin just sits there, wide and quiet, the way it always has. The red rock formations to the south, the flat valley floor stretching out under a sky that seems larger than it has any right to be, the sagebrush moving a little in the wind, and in the northeastern corner of those 512 acres, the mesa, sitting the way it has always sat, not dramatic in any obvious way, not looming or threatening, just present. A low rise of ground that looks from a distance, like the kind of thing you would drive past without a second thought. That is part of what makes this place so difficult to write off. It does not look like anything. It does not announce itself. People who visit the region for the first time, not the ranch itself, which is not open to visitors, but the surrounding basin, often describe a kind of quiet that is not quite peaceful, not threatening either, just wide. A landscape that holds more space than you expected, and that does not seem especially interested in filling it with reassurance. The investigation out there is ongoing. As of the most recent seasons of the television production, the research team is still drilling, still running ground-penetrating radar across the mesa, still triangulating aerial anomalies with multiple cameras, still collecting soil and water samples, still trying to find a physical explanation for the readings they keep getting. The instrumentation has improved considerably since the NIDS years. The questions have not simplified at all. If anything, each answered question seems to open two more, which is either the nature of genuine scientific inquiry, or the nature of a place that does not want to be understood depending on which framework you bring to it. What 30 years of investigation has produced is not a conclusion. It has produced a record. A long, detailed, sometimes frustrating, sometimes genuinely strange record of events and measurements and witness accounts and equipment anomalies and physical evidence that does not resolve neatly into any single explanation. That record is unusual, not because every entry in it is verified, and not because every witness is beyond question, but because of the sheer consistency of it across time, and across people who had no particular reason to agree with each other. The Shermans in 1994 were not aware of the Ute oral traditions about the land. The NIDS scientists in the late 1990s were not looking for a television series. The Pentagon analysts who recommended funding AAW-SAP were not in the business of chasing folklore, and yet the accounts they each generated from their very different positions and with their very different methods keep pointing toward the same patch of ground. There is something worth sitting with in that, not as proof of anything, but as a pattern that deserves more than a quick dismissal. 30 years is a long time. $22 million is not a small number. A biochemist, a journalist, a real estate billionaire, a senator, a defense intelligence program, and a rotating cast of scientists and investigators. These are not the usual ingredients of a ghost story. Whatever is happening at Skinwalker Ranch, it has been taken seriously by people who had serious reasons to be careful about what they put their names on. And yet nothing has been confirmed. That is also true, and it matters. No photograph of a non-human entity, no recovered craft, no peer-reviewed paper that has survived scrutiny and established a definitive anomalous phenomenon at the location. The instrumented data is suggestive but not conclusive. The witness testimony is consistent but not independently verifiable in the way that science requires. The cattle mutilations remain unexplained in the most dramatic cases, but natural explanations exist for many of them and cannot be ruled out across the board. The honest position, the one that takes both the evidence and its limits seriously, is that something unusual appears to be concentrated at this location, and we do not yet know what it is. That is not a comfortable place to rest. Human beings are not built for comfortable uncertainty. We want the story to end somewhere, to land on something solid. And Skinwalker Ranch, after all this time and all this effort, has not provided that landing. It has provided more questions, more data points that do not fit the existing models, more accounts from credible people describing things that our current frameworks cannot accommodate. That is either deeply frustrating or deeply interesting, depending on your temperament. Possibly both. What the ranch has come to represent in a broader sense is a kind of test case for how seriously we are willing to take anomalous phenomena. Not just UFOs, not just cattle mutilations, not just poltergeist activity, but the whole category of things that happen at the edges of what our instruments and our theories can explain. The Uinta Basin has been generating these reports for decades. The government has spent money studying them. Scientists with real credentials have spent years there and come away saying that something is happening that they cannot explain. At what point does a consistent accumulation of unexplained evidence stop being a curiosity and start being a problem that demands a more serious institutional response? Some researchers who have spent time at the ranch have come to believe that the phenomena there are not going to yield to standard investigative methods, not because they are supernatural in some religious sense, but because they may require a different kind of science, one that takes consciousness and observation into account as variables rather than treating them as irrelevant to the physical measurements. This is a fringe position in mainstream science, but it is not an incoherent one. Quantum mechanics has long grappled with the relationship between measurement and outcome. Some physicists have argued, with varying degrees of seriousness, that consciousness plays a role in the behavior of physical systems at very small scales. Whether that has any relevance to what is happening at a ranch in northeastern Utah is genuinely unknown. But the researchers who keep coming back to the interactivity claim, the sense that the phenomena respond to being observed, are pointing at something that at least rhymes with these deeper questions in physics, even if the connection is speculative. It is also worth remembering quietly that we have been here before with other phenomena. There are things that were once considered impossible or absurd that are now simply part of the landscape of what we know. Ball lightning was dismissed as mass hallucination for a long time before it was documented photographically. Meteorites were denied by European scientists in the 18th century because rocks could not fall from the sky. The deep ocean was believed to be lifeless until it was not. Science has a history of being wrong about the edges of things, and the edges tend to be where the interesting problems live. This is not an argument that Skinwalker Ranch will eventually be explained in terms that vindicate every witness account. It is just a reminder that the category of things we cannot explain has a long history of shrinking in ways that surprised everyone. The ranch itself, as a physical place, is not going anywhere. Brandon Fugel has said publicly that he intends to continue the investigation for as long as it takes to find answers, or at least to develop a clearer picture of what the questions actually are. The team that works on the property has grown and changed over the years of the television production, but the core commitment to instrument the property as thoroughly as possible and to take the anomalies seriously as physical phenomena has remained consistent. Whatever you think of the television format, that underlying commitment is real. People are spending real time and real money at a real location trying to understand something that does not fit any of the available explanations. That is not nothing. And the land keeps doing what it does. The mesa sits in the northeast corner of the property, generating its electromagnetic readings, resisting its drill bits, occasionally producing physical effects in the people who spend extended time near it. The sky above the Uinta Basin is wide and dark at night, and people who live in the region have been watching it for a very long time and describing things that move through it in ways that do not match aircraft or satellites or weather phenomena. The soil of the ranch holds whatever it holds. The compacted circles, the unusual mineral readings, the possible cavities beneath the surface that the ground-penetrating radar keeps suggesting, but the drilling has not yet confirmed. None of this is resolved. All of it is real, in the sense that the documentation exists and the people who produced it were in earnest. What it means is still open. There is something almost restful about that, if you let it be. Not every question has to be answered tonight. Not every strange thing has to be immediately categorized and filed away. The Uinta Basin has been sitting with its strangeness for a very long time, long before any of the investigators arrived with their cameras and magnetometers and government contracts. The Ute people knew this land as a place that required careful attention. They did not try to explain it away. They simply noted that it was different, that it demanded a different kind of awareness, and they treated it accordingly. There is something in that older response that the modern investigators, for all their instruments and hypotheses, have not entirely improved upon. What you are left with, at the end of all of this, is a place. A specific, physical, mappable place in northeastern Utah, roughly 512 acres, sitting in a flat valley beneath a wide sky, with a mesa in the northeast corner and a history that stretches back further than any of the scientific investigation and further back than the ranching families who came and went. A place where serious people have spent serious time and come away with serious questions that they cannot answer. A place where the government spent money it did not have to spend if the phenomena were simply folklore. A place that keeps producing accounts, decade after decade, that are consistent with each other in ways that are hard to explain through coincidence or collective suggestion alone. It is not proof of anything beyond the ordinary, but it is a genuine puzzle assembled from real pieces, sitting in the real world, waiting for tools and frameworks that may not exist yet. And there is something quietly remarkable about that. About a patch of ground in rural Utah that has managed for 30 years to resist every attempt to make it make sense, and to keep drawing in the kind of people who cannot leave a question alone. If you have been listening tonight and you have a sense of what you think is happening out there, whether you lean toward the geological, the extraterrestrial, the parapsychological, or something else entirely, the comments are a good place to put that. This is genuinely a topic where thoughtful people disagree, and where the honest answer is that nobody has the full picture yet. What you think matters here, not because any of us can resolve the question from a distance, but because the conversation itself is part of how understanding eventually builds. Thank you for spending this time out here in the quiet with Skinwalker Ranch. If this kind of careful, unhurried exploration is something you want more of, life beyond seen is where it lives, and subscribing means you will be here the next time we sit down with something strange and patient and worth understanding. Take care of yourselves tonight, wherever you are, whatever the sky looks like above you, and keep looking up.